from EXS Exercise School, and I'm also a graduate in sports science from the University of Lisbon, and I have a master's in sports rehabilitation from St. Mary's University in London. I am a personal trainer and an injury rehab specialist. I am also currently a teacher at EXS Exercise School. I would like to start by thanking our partners. Without them, this event would have not been possible to do. And in no specific order, I would like to thank SHS Exercise School. I would like to thank All United for their support, Gold Nutrition, OS Fitness Sport Systems, BH Fitness, Life Fitness, True Clinic, Precor, and Academia do Personal Trainer. The first international exercise webinar was created as a result of this pandemic that is affecting the whole world. Therefore, we at EXS Exercise School organized this event in solidarity with the exercise community worldwide. And what a better way to express this by providing high quality content shared by worldwide renowned speakers and specialists in their own field of study and practice. To everyone here watching this event, I would like to express my warm welcome and gratitude. Today, we have attendees from different parts of the globe, namely our home country, Portugal, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, United States of America, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, our neighbors, Spain, the Philippines, Brazil, United Kingdom, just to name a few. We would like to welcome all of you guys for being here with us today. We at EXS Exercise School would be grateful if you guys here attending today would please say hello in the comment box, say where you guys are from. That would be really nice for us. Our school was created in 2014 with the goal of fulfilling a gap in the education for exercise professionals. We pride ourselves for teaching evidence-based practical knowledge to our students in order to help them become exceptional professionals and to make a difference in a growing and competitive market such as the fitness industry. We teach a wide array of subjects ranging from anatomy to high-intensity strength training in our Strength Training Master Certification course, which has the duration of 1 year. For those hoping to develop their skills in working with people with chronic pathologies, we developed a certification called Clinical in partnership with the biggest private Portuguese company called Hospital da Luz. Every year, we organize our presential congress called the Exercise Summit, which was unfortunately canceled this year due to the pandemic. We are hopeful to organize it next year in May. So please keep an eye on our social media for this announcement. The International Exercise webinar is here to stay, and we are presently developing an online platform. So in the near future, we will have online education content in our platform available in English as well. And we will also be teaching abroad in English. Last but not least, I would like to welcome our speakers. It is an honor to have you guys with us. And obviously, it's amazing to learn from you. It would be an honor for us if you guys leave us a thumbs up and the clapping emoticon in the comments for our speakers. Our talks will have a duration of 25 minutes, and we will be collecting a few questions from you to present to our speakers. So please place your questions in the comment box below. Our first talk is with João Lapa from Portugal and will be held in a different format. It will be an interview about his working experience in his club. So the title of our talk will be Prehab and Rehab, Microdoses of Strength Training in the Premier League Environment. Now I will start by presenting João. João is a bachelor in sports science, has a post-graduation in nutrition, exercise, and health. He has a master's in team sports performance and is currently the physio and rehab coach at Wolverhampton in the Premier League. João, can you hear me?
Hi, Pedro. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, João. Good to hear from you.
Very good to see you.
Good seeing you too, man.
Mm-hmm.
João, I would like to talk a little bit about yourself, about your work. Tell the audience a little bit who you are and what you do.
Okay, so basically, I am a fitness and rehab coach. In the last few years, I've been working as a fitness coach in football, but the last 3 years since I joined this technical team at Wolverhampton Wanderers, I'm the rehab coach. I'm focused more on the work with injured players and also in the programs for injury prevention with the rest of the squad as well.
João, you have been working in football for quite a while. What led you to work in such a competitive sport?
Passion, I think it's the main answer. Since I'm young and a kid, I was passionate about football. Despite it was not the sport that I used to do, that I used to practice before. I used to be a sailor, using sailing boats and did some competition. But since I was a kid, I was passionate about football, and but I never had the chance to train and to practice on a club. So when I was in school and I was in university, I knew that's what I want to do. I want to be a fitness coach. That's what I like, and I was really competitive. The competition was a thing that one of the drives that on my life that brought me till here, I think.
João, one of the things that you've mentioned in our previous talks was the training you had in your masters that you've taken in Barcelona. Can you talk a little bit about that training that allowed you to develop to this high competitive level that you are at the moment?
Definitely, Pedro. For me, when I finished my degree in physical education, I was not ready to. Even when I finished the postgraduate, I was not ready to start working on professional football. And I felt that I couldn't arrive to such kind of training and demands and preparation for to deal with the problems and all the things that come from the competition and high competition and high performance as well. So a friend of mine told me about this master in Barca that since the beginning was in Barcelona. That was since the beginning. I found it very interesting because it was a very practical one. So I came off from the university with a lot of theoretical stuff, but I was missing a lot more practical. So this master was mainly with people that all the speakers were people mainly that were in the field. In the field with on team sports basically, but from different sports: volleyball, handball, football, and they were sharing all the experience they have, and these start to give me some more tools and more confidence on my work to start to work with with teams and with players in the higher level as well. So for me, it was a big experience and an improvement in my
Perfect.
skills and
And
to work in this level.
you have also taken training with our school as well.
Definitely, and this is one of the things that I think everybody should do, because you can't stop learning and you can't stop improving yourself, because if you stay with the knowledge that you got and the thing that you've been doing for always, for since ever, there is a point that every time we know that the science and the experience and the trainers around the world are trying different methods, and if you don't try to drink from this knowledge that people is sharing, that your school that as another schools are other schools are sharing and are trying to bring better and even better quality of information every time, it's fantastic. And I anytime when I have the chance, I try to do something else if I have time to keep improving and to keep learning. And now I was very happy when I listened to your presentation, and I heard that you guys are now preparing your online platform to reach. And because for me, for example, it's very hard to fly and to go to
Portugal.
to assist your conference and everything.
João, we're going to move on, and I want to talk a little bit about what's your definition of prehab?
So for me, the prehab, it's mainly the preparation and get the players ready to start training and to start and getting ready for the demands that they will have in trainings and in games as well. So we call it sometimes in activation as well. So the prehab and activation is a set of exercises that I try to the players to do according to the needs they have on previous tests that we have done before, strength tests or another kind of test that we've done with the players. And if we identify any kind of lack of strength or asymmetries or whatever, we try to we try on these times that before training, normally before training sessions with the team, trying to go in the gym and apply some programs individually for each player. And I found it that if we can do this in a more individual basis, it's much better than doing like is a lot of places they used to do. Now I'm not sure, but in a lot of places they do more in groups of players, 5-6 players in stations. But I think that one of the biggest things and better things that you can do is try to go on one-to-one, even you have a big squad and you are only 1 or 2 coaches to do it. But if you can split it by the times before the training session, and you can take much more information and profit from that time. So for me, the prehab is a main timing for injury prevention and to improve performance.
That's great, João. And one of the things that's very interesting to me is that you try to get the exercise more bespoke and tailored to the players themselves. But for that, you have to do some testing, isn't it?
Definitely. We in the preseason normally we do some battery of tests that we get so we can have the big map of our squad and our players as well. And from that, we develop the training sessions and the training programs for them to do on the prehab before the sessions. They also have to do after the group training, strength training as well. We do it sometimes, but the thing that I'm more responsible to and I'm focused more is more in the individualized work with the players. And because we do the tests in the beginning of the season, but during the season we also are constantly taking some feedback from the players on even test, and even with some manual exercises and manual tests, you can have a lot of feedback from the players, and you can identify even sometimes one exercise that you are trying to work with the player to improve something. at the same time is a test. So and you can have some feedback, which is a good tool. For example, you are doing a squeeze test with a player with your hands for groin, for example, and you can identify that the player is not so strong as used to be, and you can start thinking, taking your conclusions. Maybe this player is it losing strength? Is he tired, or he just not strong enough at the moment? Or so anytime if you are doing this constantly, you are more on the top of the players, and you can have more feedback. And when you have more information, I think you can take better decisions.
So it's a very powerful thing. Once you can actually get data collection, the more data you have, the more you're in control, the better you are at decision making.
I do believe so. It's like, for example, I don't want to be normally. I don't like to be like how can I say this in English? Like when you have the data, I don't want to be obsessed with the data. But having data, it's powerful because it's information. So you can take decisions on that. After you can see if the decisions were good or bad, but at least you have something to for you to have an idea. And I think this is important to have some data.
Absolutely, João. João, I want to move on here, and I want to show the audience some of our the data from your own season, your previous season. So if you can see here, you guys had the least amount of injuries on the Premier League. If you guys see there underlined, Wolves were the let's quote unquote the champions of the non-injured teams. So this is obviously amazing. And you mentioned to me before that this is when your work, when you guys score goals, isn't it?
Definitely, Pedro. For me, this is for me, and I think for all my teammates as well. All the physios and medical department and all the coaching staff as well. It's very grateful when you have these results. It's exactly what you're saying. It's our goals. This is when you score the goals. It's having these results for us. No doubt about that. And you only can achieve these when you have the perfect. I don't know if you say this word in English, symbiosis. Like, and everything is connected between the technical. The technical department, the medical department, and the strength and conditioning department as well. If this is completely together, we have better information for everybody, and when it happens, the player is the one who benefit from that, and then the team as well after that.
Over the course of last season, you guys only had 4 injured players, whereas, for instance, Man United had 31, and the cost of injured players. If we look at the next slide, if you look at Man City, they had 30 injured players. So in the cost of this, it was 80.3 million pounds. It's overwhelming, isn't it?
Yeah, that's definitely, it's a big cost for the clubs. And if we can have better scores and better results on that, I think everybody in the team, in the club, will benefit from that as well. So
that was a big difference from you guys and other teams. So what I wanted to talk about, João, is how hard it was to implement your methodology at the club, because the club was using a different methodology before you guys came in.
I think that was one of the biggest achievements that our team and our technical department had, was when we arrived. We implement our methodology, and thanks to the players as well. They were very receptive to that at the beginning, and when they start seeing that when you're introducing some different things, and at the beginning they might be a little bit with some doubts, and what is this? It's too hard. It's not too hard. What are we doing? But once they start seeing that they're feeling much better, they can compete and stay healthy without injuries, they start believing more on the work. And even if they don't appreciate to do this kind of work, they understand why they have to do it, and it's better for them. So that's one of them, and that's one of the biggest achievements. It's to when you can introduce your methodology, and if it works, and if they see the results, I think it's much easier.
So even if they don't believe it, they start believing it because of the results they feel in their bodies, in their game. So one of the major things is the feeling, and that obviously improves their confidence in their game, isn't it, João?
Definitely, Pedro. I think that's well, the players would be the best persons to best people to reply to answer that. But I think that is one of the main reasons, the main questions. Definitely.
Joe, one of the things you guys introduced was the application of isometrics, wasn't it? That you also studied a little bit in our training that you had in our school, wasn't it?
Definitely. I used to, and this is one of the main things that I would like to tell you about the microdoses of strength stimulus in this kind of leagues, because we have very congested time schedules and a lot of games. So most of the times you don't have enough time to do the strength sessions as you want to do it. So you have to arrange some times, and that's where I started at the beginning. The prehab is a mainly timing for me, in my opinion, to apply this kind of stimulus. So the thing is the isometrics are really useful for me, because you can apply some high intensity stimulus without creating too much fatigue, which is a great tool for me to apply, because fatigue, fatigue is a problem when the play to in this when you're competing a lot, you're trying to recover as best as you can. But sometimes the isometrics also have this important protective effect at the same times. There are studies that showing that when you apply constantly some type of isometric exercises, for example, this happens with another type of contractions as well. But with isometrics, I know it clear, and I found it very useful. You can see that after, when you are used to apply some high intensity isometric exercises, you can see that after, when you do like a game, or when you do a very exhaustive test or a stress test with a lot of load and everything, you can see that you can recover much faster to your baseline level after the competition or after the game. And you can recover your strength levels, you can recover the ability to produce force faster. So this is a tool that help us a lot to recover with so many games that we have during the season. So for me, the isometrics has a lot of potential and a lot of opportunity to be used in this context. And when I was with you guys, I really learned a lot, and even I learned with one of your teachers. I don't know how you guys call you, but when with the Nuno Pinho, he told me that, and I learned this from him, that there was a basketball coach in NBA that used to apply some isometrics exercise on recovery day as well after the
Yeah,
matches.
it's Steve Haas.
Yeah, and I start using from when I start listening to that, and used to explain that it was like applying the isometrics stimulus on the match after the match day is like you are tightening the screws of your body. So I used to say a lot of times that the players are like Formula One cars, and they have to take care of the body as they are a Formula One car. And the biggest example that I give to the players, for them to understand sometimes, for them to realize why it's so important for them, for example, the prehab. It means the warm up before the warm up with the team, preparing themselves for training, is a comparison to the Formula One cars, because I didn't know, but I did an investigation, and I found out that the Formula One cars, to start the engine, before they have to use heated oil to go through all the motor to get ready to start the engine after, because otherwise can messes up all the motor. So this is the analogy that I start to explain to the players as well. You must see and test your body before you go outside to see if everything are on the right place. All the screws are tight. For you are a machine, so you must understand that you have to be ready to go outside. And this is not 1 day per week. It must be every day, because your body is always under big stress. Guys, you are doing a lot of work on this, and you on your formations as well, on your courses as well. You know that the when a player suffers some impact or kick or whatever, the muscle, they might switch off, and after on the next day maybe he's not ready yet to do some to produce power. Maybe he's switched off, and you have to apply some exercises for him to activate the muscle again. And the release of cytokines and everything turn the muscle off after a big impact or a big kick or whatever. And if the player next day in 2 days after he didn't screw the titans again and is not ready again, he can still perform, but he start performing maybe with some compensations of other muscles, and then the problem can start beginning as well. So that's why I say, and I think that the tests are good, and this in a practical way. You don't need to create a session with a lot of machines and a lot of devices to measure the test, but maybe with some, as I told before, maybe with some manual stuff, you can have a lot of conclusions, and you can have a lot of information and feedback that might help you to improve and leave your player ready to train and to compete.
João, I think that was really, really insightful. So to wrap up, João, I would say that testing is a major part of the process. Then from testing, you can actually tailor the exercise for the players. Then try to apply those exercises, obviously individually, in micro doses or short bursts of intensity, because you can't apply that. You guys have very limited time. So you have to apply it strategically, so it doesn't create excess fatigue, isn't it? Did I get that right?
Yes, and it's like,
and not only I'm sorry, not only isometrics. Isometrics is just a part of the process, right?
Exactly. That's what I'm going to say now. For example, sometimes people are I've listened already, and people sometimes are a little bit afraid of using, for example, the eccentrics, because they say the eccentrics cause a lot of DOMs and everything, but it always depends of the amount of stimulus and the load and the intensity of the exercises. I like to do some doses, the micro dose. I like to do some small intensity eccentric exercise as well with the players, and I found it really useful, and I found the players feeling much better in such exercises. Sometimes you can't use it only one type of a contractions. You have to use all, and all are good. You just have to know when to apply it and control in the doses. The doses is very important, and the intensity of the exercises. I can do one exercise. For example, I can do one exercise, a hip thrust for a player before the training session with 100 kilos, but I don't do a big volume of that. I would do just because I know that I identify that player needs to activate a little bit more his glute, for example, and I need to apply some load. I need to put some intensity to fire that muscle. And if I don't do it, and if I do it, sorry, I'll make, because he's going to train after, I'll maybe do less volume or very short volume for not to create fatigue, And I used to say, for example, just to finish this idea of the importance of the prehab and the rehab as well. When you have to players returning to after injury as well, I used to say the players that anytime you're going to the gym, is like a piggy bank. It's like you know this expression, piggy bank. So anytime you come, it's like inserting a coin on the piggy bank, and one stimulus today is like one coin in there. One coin is nothing. When you look at the piggy bank with one coin, is nothing. You go for one training is nothing. But if you go every morning during a whole season, and you putting there some coins, some trainings by the end of after 6 months, by after 6 months, you can see maybe the piggy bank is already half, and you can see, wow, can you imagine this with stimulus for a player that doesn't do nothing, and the player that does do that does it every day, and after 6 months, it's a big amount of load and stimulus that might help him to be fit and to keep him resilient to play as well. And by the end of the year, maybe even more. So I also use this analogy for them to convince the players, because sometimes it's not easy to convince the players to come in and do all the prehab work and the activations. Even they know it's good for them and they realize that, but sometimes they just skip it. And if you don't go and push them and trying to make them understand why, it's difficult. But I found these ways is useful and help me to keep them with me in the mornings before training sessions.
João, I think that was very enlightening. And thank you so much for clarifying that for us and for the knowledge you've shared of your own experience. I think that was very, very good for everyone that listened to us.
I also say thank you for you, Pedro and the SXS. It's an honor for me and a big pleasure to be part of this panel. And I'm very glad to be part of your webinar. And I wish you all the best and hope to see you soon, maybe online. And all the best for you and take care. Stay safe.
João, stay with us just a little bit because we have a few questions from the audience.
Okay, let's see if I can answer.
We have Brian Gregorio here, and he is asking the following: except from strategy lecturing, what kind of specific physical training do we need to give the kids a day before the match? João, I turn it to you.
Wow, that's a good question, because it depends a lot of the when you're training with kids, and it depends a lot what you're going to do the match day -1, but it depends a lot of what you've been doing before as well. How many times per week are you training? It's a difficult question to answer, because for example, in my reality, the match day -1 is a day that I like to do some power exercises. For example, small, like the same principle of the low volume exercises, but is one of the days that the player must be fresher, almost not as fresh as the match day, but it's the day of the week that the player can feel a little bit much fresher. So it's a good day to apply some power exercise, and but with the kids, and depending on you're not going to spend time maybe on power exercise if you need to train and do some tactical work with the team as well. So are you training 3 times per week, 2 times per week? It depends a lot on that as well. So I hope I can give you some input on that, but I'm not. It's a difficult question because you don't know how many. It depends a lot of what you've been doing in the rest of the week as well.
Perfect, João. I think that was very insightful. Let's see the next question. So the next question is from Mohammed Barakat, and he asks, how do you test 22 to 25 players every day before training? How long does it take you to test one play? One play, I think he means before the game. I'm not sure if that's what he wants to ask. But I'll let you ask. I'll let you answer.
Yeah. I think this is a question about the testing on the prehab that I spoke. The way we work, we have a very small squad. We have normally about 18 to 19 players, so it's much less than 25 players, which is make my work easier. But we always we work with a very small squad. So for example, maybe you are not able to test every players every single day, but at least you can have an idea, or twice per week, that player was on your hands, and you had a little bit of time. You don't need to test all the exercises and all the tests that you have. You just have to, if you can get some information from all the squad by the end of the week, it's very good. Sorry, I think it's very good. So
you split it.
Yeah, you split it. Maybe you can have 5 players in one day. Maybe the other day you have 2, and the next day you have 3, because they are doing the individual work, and they are doing the individual plans. and maybe when he's doing the individual plan, you grab him and do, come here, let me try to do one exercise with you, because I found that on the training I was watching you and it doesn't seem very well your movement, or are you feeling something, and the player shares some feedback with you as well, and from that maybe you have another feedback for tomorrow to change the exercise for tomorrow, for example. So the test is not, as I said before, the test is not like real testing time. Like we're not doing a battery of tests and doing all the tests in one day for every player. No, it's not. It's like constantly doing some testing with the exercises, with devices to test, without devices, with manual resistance to test as well, and sometimes take 1 minute to do one exercise. Sometimes take me 3, 4, 5 minutes. It depends, but you don't need to do it like every day with every player.
João, we could say it's micro doses of testing.
Exactly. Good. Thanks, Pedro. Yeah, that's good.
Let's have a look at the next question. We got a question from Francisco. I can't see the whole question. I think it's a long question. João, the rest needs to be proper. Most of these players like to party hard and don't rest. What do you have to say to this, João?
Well, when this happened,
I think there's an assumption there, because some players are very responsible. Not all of the players like to party hard.
Yeah. Well, when they like to party hard, I think they are on the wrong business, and this is a matter of awareness of the players. There are players sometimes that they are so talented that they can party and they still do a lot of bad behaviors and they can still perform really well, but this is not the average of the play. This is not the, it's very,
when they have bad behavior, I mean, they're only able to sustain that for so long. I mean, they can't sustain it for the whole season.
Yeah, definitely. This is they need to rest, and if they don't rest, sooner or later something will happen, and they will be very, very bad for them, I guess.
Perfect, João. We have one last question. We have the question from Patrick Costinha, and he asks, João, it's a question in Portuguese, but I'm going to try to translate it to English for our audience. João, how do you guys do your recovery training sessions? Is it in the next day following the competition?
It depends a lot, but it depends of the schedule of the week as well. If you have many games, sometimes we do the first day of recovery next day after the match. When you have even less time, sometimes we even do straight after the match. We start doing some recovery strategies as well. It depends a lot. Sometimes is a day off, and you do the second day of recovery on the next day off after the day off. I think there's no big rule for that. It depends a lot of the feelings of the coaches as well, and how the coaches prefer and how they want to organize the week as well. So it depends a lot on that. As long as you give time after the match give enough time for him to recover, if it's on the first day, on the second day, it's not a big I think there's no big rule for that, in my opinion. Sometimes it's preferable, it's better to do on the first day. Sometimes you can, because you have it happens a lot of time, players that are on the first day after the match, you look at them and they don't seem they had played the night before. They are really fresh, but on the second day they are completely dead. So, and the other players are the opposite. On the first day they are already very tired, and the second day they start feeling much better. So depends a lot, and you can play with the week and with the options of the coach.
Perfect, João. I think that's a great answer. I just like to say to our audience, if you guys please could pop your questions in English, so everyone has easier access to to the content of this webinar. João, thank you so much once again. It's always a pleasure to hear you and to learn from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Stay safe and well done, guys.
So, João, the next our next speaker is Dr. James Steele. He is a bachelor in sports science and a PhD in exercise physiology and biomechanics, both from Southampton Solent University in the UK. Presently, he's working as an associate professor of sports and exercise science at Solent University, and he is the principal investigator at UK Active Research Institute. His presentation starts with a question. Comparisons of resistance training and cardio exercise modalities. Does modality matter when effort and duration are similar? We'll soon find out. Dr. James Steele, how are you?
Sorry, my mic was muted. Hi,
How's everyone? There you are. Great seeing you.
Good stuff.
Welcome, James.
Hey, Joel, how are you?
Very good. Welcome.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that talk. It was interesting to see how things are applied out in the real world with the athletes, particularly at that high level.
Thank you.
Amazing. João, once again, thank you. And I'll see you next time.
See you. Looking forward for your presentations, James.
See if I can live up to expectation.
See you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Okay, James. Now it's your turn. Over to you.
Okay. So can everyone, I'm hoping everyone can see the screen. Okay, so as Pedro said, the topic of my talk is going to be looking at resistance training and cardio exercise modalities and posing a question as to whether or not the modality of exercise really matters when we match effort and duration. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to so many people, particularly given the current circumstances. Pedro and the team have done a great job adapting to be able to deliver this webinar, given the current social distancing and lockdown. And considering the current context, I'm going to do a cheeky plug to begin with. So obviously, we're being heavily impacted by these social distancing measures in terms of our ability to communicate with one another and spend time with one another and talk to one another. But for those of us within this world, it's obviously having an impact on our applications of exercise and training as well, and how we apply and use it with our clients as well. So we're currently conducting some survey research to examine what impact social distancing measures are having on people's resistance training practices. So if you have a look on the screen here, we've got an English version, but also a Portuguese translation of the survey. And if you haven't already done so, it's been shared quite widely. It would be really appreciated if you could take 10 minutes of your time just to fill out this survey for us and contribute to our understanding of how people are adapting and implementing resistance training during this period. So with that out of the way, let's run through a quick outline of what I'm going to be covering. So I'm going to start off by introducing the kind of traditional resistance exercise, aerobic exercise dichotomy in exercise physiology. And then we're going to look at questioning that dichotomy by first looking at whether or not resistance exercise can improve cardiorespiratory fitness, and vice versa, whether or not aerobic exercise can contribute to improvements in strength and hypertrophy. We'll then move into studies that have actually compared the traditional applications of these exercise modalities on these outcomes, before finishing off looking at studies that fit within what we call an effort-based paradigm, and draw more robust comparisons of the specific effects of modality independent of other exercise variables. So let's start off then with a few definitions just for clarity in the context of this talk. So when I talk about resistance exercise in this presentation, I'm referring quite broadly to the modalities of exercise that we would traditionally regard as being resistance training. So free weights, resistance machines, calisthenics or bodyweight training, etc. And when I refer to aerobic exercise, or sometimes I'll refer to it colloquially as cardio, I'm referring to the modalities of exercise that are traditionally regarded as fitting within that. So cycling, running, swimming, rowing, etc. So let's start off with introducing the kind of traditional historical thought around exercise modalities within exercise physiology. So I'm hoping everyone can see my cursor on the screen as well. So here we've got a traditional kind of depiction of this resistance exercise, aerobic exercise dichotomy within exercise physiology. On the x-axis along the bottom here, you've essentially got the kind of duration of the types of activities that are being performed, and you can see across the scatter plot here a range of different types of activities. And on the y-axis, you've got the typical characteristics or phenotypes that are associated with the performance of these types of activities, or certainly the types of characteristics and the phenotype displayed by athletes that engage in these different activities. So, for example, things like Olympic lifting, powerlifting, very short bouts of activity requiring high levels of strength, power, hypertrophy, as compared to longer bouts of endurance-based activities like marathon running, which require more endurance-based phenotypes, like high capillarity, high mitochondrial densities, and typically they exhibit high VO2 maxes. Now, one of the issues with this dichotomy, and particularly looking at this sort of evidence, is that there's no real way of determining causality from this type of cross-sectional consideration of data. So there's nothing to stop us from looking at this and saying, well, those who exhibit these characteristics, so high strength, etc., tend to self-select into these types of activities. And those who exhibit these types of characteristics tend to self-select into these activities. We can't necessarily conclude that engaging in the activities causes these outcomes exclusively or to varying degrees. And I think there's been a few different points in history where this dichotomy has been kind of solidified. So back in the 70s, you had the aerobics boom from Ken Cooper and the Cooper Institute's work. In the 80s, you had the first study looking at specificity of training, particularly focusing on the interference of different training modalities. So Hickson looked at combining resistance and exercise modalities and found that there were diminished adaptations as a result of the combination of the two, suggesting there might be some interference effect, although more recently we know that this is more than likely due to an overtraining effect and not necessarily a specific interference. And then in the mid-2000s, Phil Atherton and colleagues first reported on what they called the AMPK-PKB switch, it's the adenosine monophosphate kinase, protein kinase B switch, sometimes referred to as AKT, which kind of solidified this molecular signaling these contrasting molecular signaling pathways that were thought to be predominantly responsible for the divergent adaptations shown or seen in those who engage in either resistance exercise or aerobic exercise. So this kind of solidified this thinking. We have this cross-sectional data. We have kind of plausibility from sexy molecular signaling studies. But more recently, people have begun to start questioning this traditional dichotomy. And when I say people, it's predominantly the likes of myself and my colleague, Dr. Fisher, who you'll hear speak at the end of this webinar. So we started asking questions like, well, can resistance training actually improve cardiorespiratory fitness? You know, is it really limited to just aerobic exercise? And vice versa, can aerobic exercise really improve strength and hypertrophy? And if either of these can produce those outcomes, then what are the mechanisms involved in stimulating and producing the physiological adaptations that result in those? And if they can produce these outcomes, then how comparable are they between the modalities? So even if, for example, aerobic exercise could improve strength and hypertrophy, is it ever going to be as much as we can see with resistance exercise, and vice versa? If resistance exercise could improve cardiorespiratory fitness, is it ever going to be to the same degree as we would see with aerobic exercise? So even if there's not, strictly speaking, a dichotomy, is there still that kind of spectrum in terms of the magnitude of adaptation between the two exercise modalities? So what I want to do is spend a bit of time going through each of these questions and reviewing some of the evidence around them. So we'll start off with the question of whether resistance exercise can improve cardiorespiratory fitness. And there is pretty good evidence now that resistance exercise does improve outcomes such as VO2 max, improves things like economy of movement, which is to say that for a given absolute workload, there is a reduced requirement for energy expenditure, oxygen consumption. There are improvements in lactate threshold, and there's evidence showing improved time to exhaustion and velocity at VO2 max, all important characteristics associated with endurance performance and indicative of cardiorespiratory fitness. And these have been covered in a range of studies which have been reviewed in papers such as the paper on the left, which is a review paper from ourselves back in 2012, where we looked at the effects of resistance training, particularly to high intensities of effort, so to momentary failure, and its effects on cardiovascular fitness or cardiorespiratory fitness, and the acute physiological responses and the chronic adaptations that are produced. And Ozaki-san and colleagues shortly after that also reviewed the evidence for resistance training improving VO2 max, also showing that there are obviously diminished magnitudes of outcome when we start off with a high level of fitness as opposed to when we start with a low level of fitness, which you'd expect from any kind of exercise intervention. More recently, and this is a pretty exhaustive meta-analysis looking at both short, medium, and long-term studies of resistance exercise interventions on cardiometabolic outcomes. And these are specifically the forest plots looking at VO2 max. So we've got short-term, medium-term, and long-term studies. And for those of you unfamiliar with forest plots, essentially each of the lines here show the estimate of the effect from each of the individual studies. And the black diamonds on either of the all of the forest plots show the meta-analyzed overall effect estimate. And in this case, because it's on the right-hand side of the forest plots in either case, it's suggesting that there is a significant improvement in VO2 max compared to controls as a result of resistance exercise. So there's pretty overwhelming evidence that cardiorespiratory fitness improves as a result of engagement in resistance exercise. So what are some of the potential mechanisms for that? So this is a figure we presented in our review in 2012, trying to kind of summarize some of the acute responses that occur when high intensity of effort muscular contractions are performed using resistance exercise modalities based on the evidence we reviewed. So there's metabolic, molecular, and cardiovascular acute stimuli that occur when engaging in these types of activities, including maximal local aerobic metabolism, increased oxygen consumption, increases in blood lactate production, an increase in the adenosine monophosphate to adenosine triphosphate ratio, which is what stimulates the AMPK pathway, which was traditionally thought to be primarily associated with endurance exercise. So there's actually evidence that this molecular signaling pathway is stimulated as a result of resistance exercise. And then we have a range of different cardiovascular outcomes which stimulate both acute stimuli, which stimulate both peripheral and central adaptations as a result of engagement in resistance exercise. So these acute responses translate then into the chronic adaptations that we see in physiological phenotype across metabolic, molecular, and cardiovascular categories, which then facilitate the improvements that we see in cardiorespiratory fitness, such as improvements in VO2 max and economy of movement. So we see increased mitochondrial enzymes, proliferation of mitochondria, so an increase in the number. We see a kind of phenotype switch from type 2X predominantly to type 2A profile, and there are peripheral adaptations in terms of increased capillarization as well, all of which contribute to the improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness we see. So there's pretty good evidence that resistance exercise can improve cardiorespiratory fitness. What about whether aerobic exercise can improve strength and hypertrophy? So again, I'm going to focus primarily on the review level evidence here. And again, we've got a number of reviews, some of which are from Ozaki-san and colleagues, again, looking specifically at things like cycle training and its effects on hypertrophy and strength gain. And then this review from Konopka and Harbour as well, which was quite widely publicized, looks at the effects of aerobic exercise modalities on skeletal muscle hypertrophy. And again, there's pretty good evidence that both strength and hypertrophy do improve as a result of engagement in aerobic exercise modalities. Similarly, though, we see that those obviously who are a bit more deconditioned to begin with lower strength and hypertrophy levels, such as those who are older, typically exhibit larger effects in these outcomes. And Konopka and Harbour, again, they reviewed also the potential mechanisms for why aerobic exercise training might influence skeletal muscle hypertrophy and potentially influence strength and power and so forth as well. And they reviewed a number of both direct, including things like muscle protein synthetic responses, and indirect adaptations, such as reduced chronic inflammation, which might interfere with molecular signaling pathways for upregulation of protein synthetic responses, showing that there are a range of plausible mechanisms for why aerobic exercise can potentially increase muscle hypertrophy and strength and so on. So there's evidence that either or modality can produce changes in the outcome to which, based on the traditional dichotomy, we would not necessarily expect to see. But what about comparing the two directly together? Well, first of all, I'm going to focus on studies that have reviewed or compared traditional applications of aerobic exercise modalities and traditional applications of resistance exercise modalities. So these are, for example, exercise interventions using aerobic exercise modalities where they're long in duration, they're low in intensity of effort, versus the more typical kind of multi-set, may or may not be relatively high effort, but certainly relatively higher effort than the aerobic interventions. So these are what we might consider if we kind of colloquially thought about resistance exercise or cardio exercise. And if we look at cardiorespiratory fitness first, some of the studies that have directly compared the two find that there are improvements in VO2 max, but no significant differences between the improvements produced by aerobic exercise or resistance exercise. However, a number of other studies do show that there are greater improvements in VO2 max as a result of aerobic exercise modalities. So that's score one for the traditional dichotomy. What about if we look at strength outcomes? So again, focusing on similar studies, and many of these have measured the same outcomes, so you'll see the same studies popping up. One study shows that there are similar improvements in strength as a result of either intervention. But most of the studies certainly show that resistance exercise produces more robust improvements in strength compared to a traditional aerobic exercise modalities. And with respect to hypertrophy, fortunately, there was a recent meta-analysis performed by Gergich and colleagues that looked at aerobic exercise performed in that traditional manner compared to resistance training interventions, and found pretty robust evidence that there are much greater responses in terms of muscle hypertrophy as a result of resistance exercise. Now, there are a few potential issues with drawing conclusions strictly about the modality of exercise as a result of these studies. So most of the studies tend to use outcome measures that may favor one modality over the other in terms of the outcome. So for example, many of the studies have used aerobic training interventions that were performed on a treadmill and then tested cardiorespiratory fitness on the same device. Conversely, resistance exercise might have been performed on a knee extension, for example, and then strength was tested on the knee extension using a dynamic 1RM. So there is the potential that there is a specificity effect being demonstrated and not necessarily similarities in terms of the physiological outcomes that are produced as a result of the interventions. Also, as I've highlighted, these are looking at what we would call ecologically valid applications of these two interventions. So not only does the modality differ between them, but also things like the effort employed and the duration of the exercises differ. So it's difficult to say whether aerobic exercise modalities differ from resistance exercise modalities when it could purely be a result of the way in which these activities are typically performed. So to finish up then, we're going to look at studies that have actually compared resistance exercise and aerobic exercise modalities whilst attempting to match the effort and the duration of these activities. So this is what we call, what we've referred to as an effort-based paradigm. So the idea that, from our perspective, is that if we perform high-effort muscular actions, irrespective of the external modality that's used to elicit those high-effort muscular contractions, we'll likely see improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness, strength, hypertrophy, and potentially a host of other outcomes which have yet to be examined. So We'll focus first on the acute responses. And so this is a great study, I believe was performed in Portugal, that looked at aerobic exercise intervention modalities compared to resistance exercise modalities. So the aerobic exercise modalities were upper and lower body cycle ergometry, and the resistance exercise was essentially squat and bench press performed on a Smith machine. And they matched the intensity of effort for these two modalities set at the onset of blood lactate accumulation. So they went through a process of determining what the intensity of effort required for eliciting a blood lactate concentration of 4 millimoles for either of the modalities was, and then perform the exercise bouts matched to that modality for the same duration of time. And they essentially found that there were no differences in the oxygen uptake performed required during the resistance exercise modalities or the aerobic exercise modalities. In terms of the motor unit recruitment that's seen between them, this study by Kuznetsov and colleagues looked at wavelet analysis of surface EMG activity in single-leg bicycle task and a single-leg knee extension task, both performed to momentary failure. And although there were differences in terms of the EMG intensity during the task, at the point of momentary failure, there was little difference between the two, suggesting there may be at task failure, so that's to say at maximum effort, similar motor unit recruitments between the two exercise modalities. This is an acute study that we performed in our lab, and we tried to look also at high intensity of effort applications of these exercise modalities, and we also tried to use what could be considered still ecologically valid applications. So where high intensity interval training protocols are quite popular now, we decided to use a recumbent bicycle ergometer so that it could be a similar position or as similar as possible to the leg press for the resistance exercise. And we got the participants to perform 4 sets of 60-second sprints and 4 sets of 12 repetition maximum, with the rep duration controlled so that each set lasted 60 seconds. So the duration and the effort was matched between the two. And we looked at a range of different outcomes, and we didn't find any significant differences for any of them. So similar oxygen consumption, similar respiratory exchange ratio, similar blood lactate production, similar energy expenditures, similar muscle swelling responses, and similar EMG variables as well. So it seems as though there's pretty good evidence that when you match effort and duration, the physiological responses acutely are very similar between these two modalities. But what about the chronic adaptations? Do these acute stimuli actually translate into similar adaptations? So we've recently tried to pull together and meta-analyze some of the studies that are available that have looked at comparing modality when matching effort and duration. So I'm going to present you the results of those now. So this first forest plot is for cardiorespiratory fitness outcomes. And on the left-hand side, if any of the dots on the forest plot are on the left-hand side, it suggests favoring the cardio or the aerobic exercise intervention. And on the right-hand side, it favors the resistance exercise. If they cross over on the 0 line, then it suggests that there was no significant difference between the two. Now, some of these studies are noted as unpublished because they're actually studies from our lab where we're in the process of still completing them. So this is preliminary data. One of these studies is from one of my PhD students, and another study is from another group. And what we find when we meta-analyze the differences in terms of cardiorespiratory fitness outcomes between the cardio or the resistance training modalities in effort and duration match studies is that there's no difference or no significant difference between the two. And the effect size is incredibly small as well. So even at best, if there was a slight favoring for the cardio group, it's a very, very small difference. When we look at the strength outcomes when comparing these interventions, we see that there looks like there may be a slight favoring for the resistance training interventions, albeit not significant and still very small. And this seems to actually be predominantly driven by the effect sizes coming from Alvarez and colleagues. And these studies or these effect sizes do somewhat fall prey to that specificity effect I mentioned. So they measured strength using 1 rep max testing for the exercises the resistance exercise group actually performed. Whereas in the other 3 studies, they used strength outcomes that were not performed during the intervention. So they're a little more representative of the general strength adaptations that were produced. So I'm shortly running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up and conclude for you. So we covered the traditional exercise, the traditional dichotomy in exercise physiology, which suggests that aerobic exercise improves cardiorespiratory fitness and resistance exercise improves strength and hypertrophy. And hopefully I've shown you today that this isn't strictly speaking as clean cut as most people typically think. Aerobic exercise can improve strength and hypertrophy, and resistance exercise can improve cardiorespiratory fitness. And it seems as though these outcomes are related to acute mechanisms related to high effort muscular actions. Now, when we do compare the traditional applications of aerobic exercise and resistance exercise, there seems to be some evidence that supports this traditional dichotomy. But when we look through an effort-based paradigm and we match the effort and duration required for performance of either an aerobic exercise mode or a resistance exercise mode, we see that there are very similar outcomes between the two. So what are some practical applications that you can take away from this? So if you're training yourself or if you're training clients, I think what this does is it expands the toolbox that you've got to use, or expands the use of the tools that you currently have in your toolbox. So for example, you might have an injury that prevents you from engaging in certain modalities of exercise, which mean that you have to adapt and use something else. Knowing that there are similar adaptations between the two means that you can do so, and you can even deliberately enable variety to be built into any programming without compromising the adaptations that you're going to produce. So ultimately, you can program for client preferences or your own preferences. The real key, though, is to just aim to maximize the effort that you engage in any of these modalities to enable similar physiological adaptations to occur. So I think I'm a little bit early there, so we should have some time for questions. And I'd like to take this moment to say thank you very much for listening, and look forward to hearing from everyone.
Dr. Steele, thank you so much for sharing that knowledge with us. It was really insightful. I think everyone is really appreciating that. And now we're going to move over to the questions. We have a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
But before that, it'd be interesting to also know what you are doing at the moment in terms of your research. If you would be kind enough to disclose that.
Sure. Okay. So I did mention that there are a couple of unpublished studies that presented some data on there, and one of them is complete and it is under review. And in fact, actually, the preprint of that study is available. So I'm happy to share that, and you can send the link out to the attendees. One of the studies we're kind of halfway through, and due to current circumstances, we're not able to continue collecting the data for it. But hopefully, once things are back to normal, we'll be able to continue. And that's actually a within participant study design where we're using a within participant design, which enables us to have greater statistical power for the comparisons we perform. And because we've reduced that kind of variability between individuals in separate groups. And we've got an interesting protocol where participants are performing single leg press or single leg recumbent cycling using the same protocol that we used in the acute study. So they're performing sprints, essentially high intensity interval training using one leg on the recumbent cycle, or performing sets to failure on the leg press using one leg. And then we're comparing obviously single leg responses for cardiorespiratory fitness, strength outcomes, and for muscle hypertrophy as well using ultrasound.
I'm quite curious to see the outcome of that.
Yeah, it should be interesting. So far, descriptively, there's not a lot of difference. The only we do see that one outcome that favours the cycling group is essentially the time to exhaustion on the VO2 max test. So we speculate that's purely because they get better at single leg cycling, which is quite hard. So there's a learning effect. But actually, the VO2 max that they get is not necessarily improving to a greater degree than the improvements that we're seeing in the resistance training group.
Brilliant. Now we're going to move on to our audience's questions. We have a question from Francis Cruz. He asks, during resistance training, what is the best tool in measuring the heart rate?
Okay. Well, probably a heart rate monitor. I can't really speak to. Yeah.
Well.
So I'm not sure whether he's alluding to comparisons of wrist-worn or chest strap-worn heart rate monitors. I'm not actually sure if there are any direct comparisons in terms of the validity of wrist or chest worn heart rate monitors in resistance exercise specifically. There are slight differences when you look at either chest or wrist worn in other exercise modalities. But any heart rate monitor is going to be absolutely fine to track heart rate during your resistance exercise bouts if you want to track that.
I remember that 10, 15 years ago, chest straps were the gold standard, and now smart watches have become their technology has improved so much that it become widespread.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so validity is obviously the accuracy of the measures is very important if you're looking at something a little bit more fine grained, such as heart rate variability measures. But if you're merely just looking at averages and peak responses during a bout of exercise, then a pretty cheap chest worn monitor is absolutely fine. Or if you've got a smartwatch with a built-in heart rate monitor, then that's likely to be absolutely fine. And it's worth bearing in mind you're comparing it within participant largely anyway, so you'll be able to know relative to yourself what the responses look like.
And one of the things that's being more and more explored in the research is actually heart rate variability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting area that because it is quite easy to measure. Everyone's kind of jumped on the bandwagon, but much like things like EMG, because it's easy to measure, it's easy to get wrong as well. And I'm certainly not an expert in it. So I'll leave that for other people to talk about.
Absolutely. Let's have a look at our next question. So the question is from Oli Bash. He says the following: in regards to muscle fiber types, would a lower body modality comparison on either aerobic exercise or resistance exercise show results differently from an upper body modality comparison?
That's an interesting question. The short answer is I can't see any reason why there would be any differences in terms of fiber type adaptation. I assume you're referring to the kind of phenotypic switching from a type 2X profile to a more sort of type 2A profile that I alluded to as a potential physiological adaptation facilitating those improvements in fitness. Upper body muscle is physiologically very similar, even if anatomically different from lower body muscles, and there's no reason to specifically think that there would be specific adaptations. In fact, Brad Schoenfeld's lab have in the last week or so published a great study. I've yet to get stuck into it and read it fully, but comparing different load manipulation, so higher loads and lower loads in the soleus and gastrocnemius to see whether or not there are differing adaptations depending upon the typical fiber type that you see in those muscles. And they essentially found that independently of the muscle and its predominant fiber type, and independently of whether it was heavy or light load training, there were very similar adaptations between the two.
That's very, very interesting. I think Dr. Stuart Phillips done some studies, and he reached the same conclusions.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking to more data that we've got under review, well, that we're preparing at the moment as well, we've got some EMG wavelet-based analyses looking at the motor unit recruitment patterns between high and low load resistance training to failure, quite clearly showing that although the kind of recruitment patterns that you see differ considerably, there's a more kind of sequential recruitment during low loads to failure and more of a kind of synchronous recruitment from the get-go with higher loads. Ultimately, the data seem to suggest that recruitment upon task failure is very, very similar, and the full cadre of motor unit types are very likely recruited, assuming you go to task failure.
I think this is very interesting because it gives us some practical practical guidelines to be able to apply it in practice. Let's go for the next question. So we got a question from Jose Amaral. Very good presentation, but I need to go running. I think it's a question, not
not a statement. maybe he's thinking his VO2 max is low and he needs to go for a run to improve it. But the point is, you may not need to go for a run to improve it.
Exactly.
I think the one thing that's worth stating is that without a doubt, if you are testing VO2 max using a particular testing modality, so on a bike, on a treadmill, on a rowing ergometer, or whatever, you will probably see the greatest improvements as a result of specifically practicing that test, purely because of the specificity elements associated with it. Although I would question whether or not, certainly based on our data, as I mentioned, so for example, in the study I was referring to, so far the leg press data, leg press intervention seems to be producing the same improvements in VO2 max, even though the cycle ergometer intervention is producing a greater improvement in time to exhaustion on the VO2 max test. So I think physiologically, the underpinning phenotype that results in we're essentially trying to get at by measuring VO2 max is improved similarly independent of modality, but the specific adaptations associated with the performance of that task are going to be quite tied to whatever that specific task is. So if for example, I had this question previously where firefighters, for example, have to meet certain fitness standards, and they're, at least in many places in the UK, they are actually VO2 max tests, and they need to reach a particular VO2 max. And a colleague of mine was looking to join the reserve fire service and asked for some advice on how he could improve his VO2 max for the testing. And I said, just find out what the test is and just practice the test, because that's going to give you the best chance of passing the test. Even if the physiological adaptations may not be much different than what you might get from another training intervention.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. Let's go for the next one. And the next one is from Reda Loziut. She asks, does muscle hypertrophy equal increases muscle bulk? If so, why do bodybuilders use resistance training predominantly to build muscle and not aerobic exercise?
That's a good question, and I think so muscle hypertrophy, essentially we're talking about increases in muscle size or muscle mass, and it's a good question about why bodybuilders particularly engage in resistance training and don't engage in aerobic exercise modalities. And I think that kind of harkens back to the point I made when presenting that scatter plot of the different types of activities. This is not to say that bodybuilders couldn't have necessarily improved muscle size by engaging in aerobic exercise modalities to a high intensity of effort. Based on the experimental data we have, it seems as though muscle hypertrophy can similarly improve, assuming you perform muscular contractions to a high effort, whether that is a result of turning a pedal on a bike or whether it's a result of squatting or pushing a leg press. The muscle doesn't necessarily know what it's contracting against. All it knows is that it is acting to a particular intensity of effort, which requires particular excitation, and it experiences then the internal physiological milieu associated with performing that action. So I think basically, I guess what I would say is bodybuilders might be able to produce similar improvements in muscle size as a result of aerobic exercise, or aerobic exercise modalities, I should be clear. So not necessarily performing long duration, slow, low intensity of effort aerobic activities, but engaging in high intensity of effort activities. And in fact, in studies of trained individuals, where you don't really see much in the way of hypertrophic adaptation anyway, it seems as though stopping a resistance training intervention and engaging in high intensity of effort aerobic modality activities such as high intensity interval training is best for maintenance of muscle size as well. So I think physiologically the stimuli are very similar. But if we're talking practically, engaging in resistance exercise is probably more fun. It's probably what they enjoy. It's probably what they prefer. And in fact, the fact that they do it suggests that they at least believe it's better for them. But physiologically, I don't think it necessarily makes much of a difference.
That's great. I just would like to say to our audience, if you guys won't mind taking a screenshot and identifying us on Instagram, so more people can actually follow us. We got another question coming up. Just 1 second. This question is from Guilherme Magalhães, and he asks, in high performance soccer, how would you suggest to be the right doses of resistance exercise training and aerobic training? Do you think we should prioritize it along the season, pre-season until mid-season, with the breaks included? It's quite a question.
Yeah, and I think it harkens back to the previous discussion around prehab. So actually, this isn't a situation where I would say I would personally focus more on resistance exercise in this context. And part of that is because in terms of injury prevention, there is far better evidence for resistance exercise modalities. Most resistance exercise modalities can be performed in a potentially safer manner than most aerobic exercise modalities, particularly in a soccer environment where most of that will be high-speed running, sprint intervals and things like that, which have to be performed, obviously, to train the specific skills associated with engaging in that sport. But as a result of that, you don't want to necessarily engage in too much of those activities and potentially increase the risk for injury. So it's difficult to say exactly what the correct dose is because it's going to be very contextual depending upon the demands at different periods of the season, the specific match calendar that the team has, what days they're playing, what days they have training, etc. So it's going to be very contextual. But arguably, I think what we should be potentially focusing on is a minimal effective dose. So one that is enough to produce improvements in the outcomes that are of interest, in this case, improving the physiological characteristics associated with strength, fitness, etc., and also maximizing injury risk reduction, and essentially leaving as much time as possible to engage in the elements of training and practice that we have far more confidence will actually contribute to performance directly. So that is to say, actually going through tactical plays, mental preparation, specific skill preparation associated with the sport. We should be focusing, as little time as is needed on the strength and conditioning work that we do with those athletes to make sure that they're robust enough to actually go out and practice the thing that they do for a living, which is their sport.
I think that was very similar to what João exposed from his work. But for that, you need to kind of get some data collection in terms of in the form of some testing in order to develop that proper stimulus. So you won't go beyond a certain stimulus that would obviously be detrimental for their performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. James Steele, we got one last question in the context of ultra distance running. What is the importance of strength training for improving VO2 max? That's a very interesting question.
That is a very interesting question. So with respect to ultra endurance running specifically, well, first of all, I guess it's worth reiterating that in terms of improving the physiological characteristic of maximal oxygen consumption, the modality probably doesn't have a huge impact. That being said, any athlete could, if they want to specifically improve their VO2 max, engage in whatever activity they choose. If you're an athlete that engages in a specific sport, though, from purely an efficiency standpoint, you're better off selecting the activity that involves your sport involves. So if you're into ultra endurance running, then probably the best modality for you to choose in terms of efficiency is going to be running in order to improve your VO2 max. Now, I guess the assumption here is that a high VO2 max is important for your ultra distance running performance. And of course, there is on a kind of population level an association between the VO2 max someone has and their performance in endurance activities, even in ultra endurance activities. So those typically with a higher maximal oxygen consumption will typically be those who perform better in these types of activities. But as with most things, once you start getting up to those elite levels, that correlation begins to disappear. And at the highest levels, the best athletes are not necessarily those that have the highest VO2 max, because there are so many other confounding variables that influence performance. So and I'm actually going to relate an anecdote from someone I know who does engage in ultra endurance racing, and he tends to limit his training to primarily low dose, very high intensity of effort, very brutal interval training and resistance training, and then performs essentially a minimal effective dose of the distances that he would need to run for the actual events he engages with to get used to the pacing and how those events feel. One of the things he related to me was that the purpose of engaging in those brutal interval sessions and those really high intensity of effort, to momentary muscular failure resistance training sessions is essentially to begin habituating him to how horrible the discomfort feels when performing, these types of activities. So it's almost kind of increasing his pain tolerance, because he knows that the actual ultra distance events are going to hurt. And in fact, there is evidence that pain tolerance is improved as a result of engaging in exercise activities that involve high levels of discomfort. And we've speculated actually that some of the endurance improvements that you see from engaging in, for example, low load to failure resistance exercise are a result of the fact that people habituate to how uncomfortable it feels to do those very low load exercises to momentary failure.
That's great. I was actually going to mention the relationship between pain and how much pain someone can endure during exercise. That's a major factor to impact exercise. So not only just obviously the development of VO2 max, but also the development of pain endurance in a certain way. When we have one last question. So this question is from Ishan Raina. At what point do you think interference occurs, especially when HIIT and max strength training? I'm not sure if I understood the question, but I think he mentions if there is interference of one training over the other one.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer specifically, I guess, because there will be some inter-individual variability, no doubt. Obviously, some people are going to be able to recover more quickly than others. Some people can tolerate higher volumes of training. Really, there's an element of common sense in this as well. So in the Hickson study that I referred to, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head now the exact volume and frequency of training that they performed, but it was pretty high. I think towards the end of the intervention, the aerobic exercise intervention, which did involve some interval training, if I remember correctly, and the resistance training intervention, which involved quite high intensity of effort resistance training, were being performed sort of 6 and 5 days a week, respectively. So that was a pretty high volume. That's most days of the week performing some aerobic exercise modality to a relatively high intensity of effort and some resistance exercise modality. So we know at least that there will be diminished adaptations in both strength and aerobic cardio-respiratory fitness once you're getting up to those types of frequencies. Most people, though, there is a recent review article, a meta-analysis, I believe, I think came from Jeremy Lenecky's group that looked at this. But for most individuals, kind of, anywhere between sort of 1 to 3 times a week for either modality is likely to be sufficient and not likely to engage to result in that kind of overtraining related interference effect. But as with most things, when it comes to planning training volume and training frequency, mileage varies on an individual to individual basis. So you may be an individual, you may work with athletes, as Joao said, some of his athletes will recover quicker than others, and he needs to be cognizant of that so that he can program training appropriately for the team, kind of on a kind of individual basis. Like, he'll know whether or not there are certain individuals who are not necessarily recovered well enough to go into their next bout of training, and he wants to avoid that kind of overtraining effect because it might diminish the outcomes that they're getting in terms of the strength and fitness improvements, but also it may increase their risk of injury if they're fatigued going into games as well. So yeah, it's something that you have to kind of play around with to some extent on an individual basis.
Brilliant, Dr. James Steele. Thank you so much. We have Emiliano already waiting. He's going to be pulled in. There he is. Emiliano,
hello, Pedro.
thank you.
Hey,
Hello. Hey, James. Hello.
how are you doing?
Good, good. And you?
Very good, very well.
Strange times, but it's also good because we have these opportunities to have this kind of moments of learning. And thank you for your intervention. It was very good.
Thank you.
Dr. James Steele, thank you so much once again. It was a pleasure being here with you and able to share your knowledge. And I hope to see you very soon.
And you, Pedro. Hopefully, once this is all over, we can grab a beer.
Thank you so much. See you soon.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.
So now I'm going to present Emiliano, our next speaker. So Emiliano is an exercise physiology. He's also Portuguese, as I am. He's graduated in sports science, physiology, and functional recovery, and is the BioPerformance Center Director in Madrid, and the head of sports performance for various brands and teams of motorsports. The title of his talk is The New Paradigms in Human Performance. Welcome, Emiliano. It's a pleasure to have you here. The audience is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be here in this wonderful first international exercise webinar by XSS. Thank you for the invitation and for these wonderful people that I've been listening. It was a really remarkable first intervention. I'm here to share some things related with the human performance. I don't know if we can have the presentation. Okay.
It's on. Go for it.
First of all, you already introduced me a little bit. I'm the director of the BioPerformance Center in Madrid. I've been working in motorsport since 2009. Before that, I used to be a technical director of several gyms. Also a trainer working with athletes of many modalities, many sports. And my path has been going through high performance and also fitness. And I consider myself a world traveler in terms that I've been working all over the world, and my athletes are in all the parts of the world. So related with the performance and what we're going to talk today, the idea is to talk a little bit about the performance in terms of paradigm, in terms of dimensions and considerations. In terms of performance, of human performance, we need to take in consideration, for example, the individual, the athlete, or the purpose of what we are doing, because performance can be mentioned as a capability to perform at an optimum level for a long time in terms of consistency. It can be related for injuries or free injuries when you talk about a championship or a season, or we can talk about the result or in terms of a winning. So everything, it can become a performance act. And we need, when we choose the path that we want to act under performance, we need to take this in consideration. Of course, the individual has his values, the culture, the means that he possesses to access the preparation. In terms of the athletes, or we're speaking about the capability, the trainability, of course, the talent for the sport or the activity that we are doing. And of course, the goals, like I said, that if we are talking about injuries, or if we are talking about results, or if we are talking about regularity. All of these can interfere with the performance. So when we speak about performance, we are talking about multiple key areas with an interaction to each other. So if you're talking about health or recovery of training, nutrition, biodynamics, and we call biodynamics, for example, the problems that, or the movement ability of the body, or the problems that the body can feel in a certain time or a certain way that we can work, and it can be a problem to access training. For example, if you feel a headache, or if you feel a back pain, this is not a medical problem, but this is a biodynamic problem that can really affect performance. So you need really to achieve a way in order to work in a consistent way, but in order to be able to work always without the problems that can be common for a normal individual, but for an athlete can impact the overall performance. And of course, you have the mental energy, the capacity of applying energy. So if you are talking about performance, we need always to have like a performance index, and we correlate all these areas, and we have the momentum or the energy that we need to apply this. And for that, we need the opportunity, we need the right environment, the right mentality, and the right capability to apply all of this in one certain momentum. So this is what we try to do, is try to manage all of these items in order to create this optimum level of performance where athletes can compete. So we in the BioPerformance Center, we work in a model. There are several models that you can work. This is ours. We work in a model that we start with an evaluation. Normally it's performed at the center. We then do a monitoring, and this monitoring, because, well, like I said, we work with athletes all over the world. So this monitoring, normally it's at distance. So we rely on wearables or technology to do so. And then we access the competition. So we have a person that goes to competition and then access the competition and helps the athletes to develop some level of performance. And then after that, we work on recovery. We pay a differential attention to recovery, because we believe that recovery is the key of all sports, and the key part for you to be performing well and to keep performing at the optimum level. It doesn't matter if you achieve a certain level of performance, if you're not able to maintain it, then it doesn't become reliable or sustainable all through time. So you are not capable to maintain yourself on the top of the performance, on the top of your sport in the world. So through this, if we start with the athlete evaluation, I will speak only about the things that I consider that they are very new. They are not common or not accessible to everyone. So that's why the goal here is to talk about the new paradigms of performance. And when we talk about athlete evaluation, when we have the DNA analysis, for example, and we're looking for genetic markers to injury risk or recovery, or things simple like caffeine metabolism, or even the peak hour of training, and we can know that by analyzing the genetic. And genetic becomes then the mainframe where athlete is putting everything, or every kind of impact or stimulus that we are doing is having a way to interfere with the human body. Of course, we also do brain scans, and brain scans can determine, for example, the levels of dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA, or serotonin, or we analyze the brain waves in order to understand which kind of thinking, which kind of mental path the athlete is putting into competition. We have some simulators when the drivers can test and can be on the simulator at the same time that we are reading the EEG. And with that, we can know, for example, the engagement with the task, the levels of stress, the levels of focus. And we analyze that, like I said, through the brain wave, and with things like emotive or other devices that we use that are so portable, and we can use also in trainings to compare them if the training is giving the right result for the athlete. And then we're talking about blood parameters. And we talk about blood parameters in the perspective of an athlete, not in the perspective of a normal, healthy person that they are. But for example, when I talk about hemoglobin levels, and they can go for 12.7 to 17.7 grams per deciliter. In an athlete, they need to be more near the 17.7 than to the 12.7. The percentage of hemocrotics, for example, they go from 36% in the normal person to the 50.5%. And I want to be close to the 50.5%. Of course, if I pass that, you'll go test positive for doping or erythropoietin or something that can cause an increase that is a normal. But as a human being and as a normal values, you want to be near the values that really can help the athlete to achieve a certain level of performance, in this case, in terms of resistance. But if you're talking about vitamin B12, that is very important for the athletes, the normal range goes from 211 to 911. So, and it's because it's so important for the athletes, we want to be near the 911. And we go the same as TSH or the hormones or the testosterone levels, and everything that we try to improve, and we need to access from the beginning. And this can also help the athletes to be in a level that we want in order to compete. We analyze the gut, and this has to do not only about inflammation or the wrong microbiome, but also substances like TMAO that are highly correlated, for example, with the risk of cardiovascular diseases or even longevity, or the metabolism of choline. And acetylcholine is one of the precursors, is one of the substances the brain uses to perform. So we need to analyze and to know if, for example, the gut analysis, these substances are there. We analyze urine, even in competition, and urine gives us a high level of dehydration, for example, inflammation, the amount of ketones that are available in terms of energy. And we analyze saliva for understanding the cortisol path through the day. For example, if the cortisol is too low in the morning, you will not be able to compete properly. If it's too high on the night, you're not able to sleep properly. So all of this evaluation on the beginning. Now, besides all the part that I have there, like the weights or the kettlebells or the biomechanics or the strength levels or the flexibility levels, all of this we pass to other level that in terms of evaluation allows us to work with a little bit more quality. And then we have the athletes in monitorization. And like I said, we use wearables. In this case, I have Whoop in there. We also work with Oura Ring or BioStrap or some other wearables that we deliver to the athletes. And we have a real-time understanding, for example, of the body strain. And the body strain, if you wake up already tired or already with a level of body strain that you cannot push that high, we need to adjust the load, the training load that day. And this helps us to understand, for example, that you already spoke before, heart rate variability, for example, to understand the autonomic nervous system, or the sleep quality to understand the different levels of the sleep that the athlete is having in terms of nutrition, in terms of temperature, and now times like the COVID-19 times that we can have this virus. It's easy to understand for an athlete the immunitary system, how it's working, or even predicts any kind of inflammation or disease in real time and act immediately. So we also check about respiratory rate, breath heartbeat, and this helps us also to plan and to act with the jet lag plan. We work with athletes that normally are competing around the world, so we need to pay really good attention to the jet lag plan, and we have different considerations since the time they should get some light, to the time he should eat, what he should eat, what time, the times of medication he can use to help the jet lag, and everything is conjugated by distance, but we always have real-time information of each athlete. And then in terms of competition, we call them the person that is following the athlete, the performance coach, and that's because it is acting in different areas. It's not possible to have someone doing like one person for a physiologist, then a nutritionist, then a trainer, a health and fitness training, then a psychologist is not possible sometimes to travel with all those people. So we have someone that has some knowledge on the areas that can have support and through the phone or through connection directly with specialists. And then he assesses the physiological state of the athlete. He adapts to the needs of the competition in terms of nutrition, and according with the autonomic nervous system, we do some activation or recovery of the athlete, and he helps with the mentality and balance or all the psychological factors that he can support at the time. And that leads us after for the training quality. So everything I said so far, it's how we work. I will try to speak a little bit now what I understand that are the new paradigms that we really interfere and we can really use to change a little bit what we are doing with the athletes. This is also our understanding how sports is evolving, how the future can work, and which direction are we taking in terms of high performance. And there's an article in the Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance by Franco Pellizzeri, I think so. And this concept of external load or internal load was first presented in 2003 in Austria. So, and this concept of Franco Pellizzeri, he says that we can separate the training in terms of external load and internal load, and it creates a very good diaphragm that everyone is using now to determine, to explain a little bit what is external load and internal load. And external load can be the weight that you're putting on the athlete, the kilometers that he's doing. We can use a GPS to track how much kilometers a player is doing. We can put some weights or control the number of kilos that he's taking or the number of calories that is including by comparison. And then we have the internal load. The internal load is the psychophysiological response that the athlete is taking at the moment that is training. And here is where lies the trick, it's where you hit the target. Because if you really control internal load, you have completely sure that your external load, that the way that is training, that the stimulus that you are giving, it hits the spot. And you have exactly what you want in terms of response. And this leads the amount of external load, if it's proper, and if you repeat this internal answer, this internal load, this psychophysiological answer, if you repeat it 2 times, you are going to increase the capability of the athlete through time with quality and less worried about things that probably are interfering on that or don't contribute to the result that you want. So if we talk about internal load, we always measure the heart rate, for example. We measure the lactate. We measure even the oxygen consumption. This was things that we could measure through technology and will allow us to identify the internal load so far. But the science is getting further, and the quality of the wearables is getting much better. So we are able to get much more information in real time. And with that, we are understanding what really is happening. For example, we have already echography or echographs that we connect to the phone and you can access the muscle and see immediately after the training how much inflamed it is, or if it's enough to produce some hypertrophy, for example. We can see through emotive or other EEG devices what is the response that the brain is having through the training and what the response in terms of focus, concentration, stress, like I told before. And this we can measure directly through the training and understand if the result of the training that we are giving is exactly what we need in terms of quality. So internal load, or the way that trainers are interfering or measuring athletes, is changing a lot. This also demands another quantity of quality of studies, of physiological understanding of the sports, of the human body, but also touching devices that until now are only accessible to medicine or to medical practices. But now we are changing a little bit the concept and using them as well to training and to control training quality. So for me, this is one of the most key and important things that we can use for training, and we can improve the knowledge. And I'm sure with the help of IFS, you guys can in the future have access to this kind of education. But this is one of the ways that we can know that all of the education we do to put together exercise or the way we're thinking about strength and conditioning can really be controlled, and we can really access the other level. And we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. And for the autonomic nervous system, we have like I have it in here, you have like a car that is pushing, you can go pushing hard at 200 kilometers hour, and then you consume fuel, you heat up the tires, the engine is heating up, everything is on fire. But then when you have to regenerate, when the fuel is over, you need to stop. Everything needs to be stopped to refuel. And then you refuel, and everything is back again to be able to compete again or to perform again. So we have these two branches of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches, and they can be used in terms of control, but in terms of also activation to be sure that the athlete is ready to perform, or to be sure that the athlete is recovering. And with that, we can access the sleep stages, for example, or the amount of stress the athlete is passing through, or if he's recovering, or if the amount of body strain that we can have. So the autonomic nervous system is a tool that is nowadays is being very used to control athletes, and we use it a lot, especially when we are at distance or in terms of competition, to adapt what we need to do as an activation or we need to do as a recovery. And then we have sleep. And sleep is being one of the key points because it affects performance in so many ways and so badly if you don't sleep properly that the recent studies, for example, they show 1.7 increased risk of injury with less than 8 hours of sleep. You have 4 times more likely to catch a cold if you sleep 6 hours instead of 7. Your reaction time impairment through time of a poor sleep, it's 45 milliseconds in median. So we have a Stanford study that shows, for example, the injuries that in NBA that can show, for example, the players that are playing, sleeping poorly, they have the lowest performance compared to the players that sleep properly. So we have nowadays many resources to understand how sleep works, but also to control and to monitoring sleep, or for example, to be able to interfere and to be able to improve the quality of sleep. And this is one of the points that we always take in consideration with the athletes, and we make sure that athletes can do the things properly. And then we have mindfulness. And mindfulness is something really new, but especially on the brain performance and brain plasticity associated with mindfulness. It's been discovered, especially this girl that I have there, Sarah Lazar. She's a researcher from Harvard, that she dedicates herself in the study of mindfulness. And we can see, for example, an increase of cortical thickness, but also the size of amygdala and the size of our reptilian brain that deals with stress after mindfulness is altered. So we're checking some changes in terms of structure, in terms of neuroplasticity, but in terms of emotional process, for example, emotion regulation, self-referential or perspective thinking. It enables it enhances our ability to pay attention or in the prevention of cognitive decline. So mindfulness now, it is really one of the areas that it's part of the mental energy, but is also part in terms of performance of a new branch that is becoming mandatory for high athletes because it has so many impacts in terms of the brain performance. And we have longevity. And longevity is one of these things that humankind always wanted to achieve. Steve Horvath is a researcher from California that is doing he was doing some studies in epigenetic clocks. And epigenetic of the DNA I think one of our colleagues is going to talk about the role of exercise in longevity, and this has to do with sirtuins and the way we activate the sirtuins and we activate the ways that our DNA can be regenerated. So basically our DNA through time, it's being decreased in terms of quality, in terms of composition, and these changes, they occurred by methylation, And some of the biomarkers, like epigenetics, is the way that our body reads our DNA. This is very important for development, but also important in terms of decrease of performance, of longevity. Nowadays, the athletes, they care about a long sports career, but also about lifestyle after the competition. And high performance has a huge impact in lifespan. So one of the things that we consider also very important is aspects related to longevity. And things like the role that Steve Horvath was doing, creating epigenetic clocks that were able to say immediately if the athlete or the age of any individual, any mammalian, and through the reading of this epigenetics, the methylation of the DNA, well, he was able to tell that our age compared in terms of DNA performance and our real age in terms of chronological age. And we talk about epigenetic age. Why? Because it's very important to understand that if we want to perform at an optimum level, our epigenetic age is going to decrease, is going to be worse. So I can be 40s, but in the end of my career with 40s, I will be 50 something. So science was able to confirm, for example, the true age of any human only analyzing the DNA. But also because of this founding in terms of checking the age, he was able to interfere in this process. And the first time last year, if you go to the internet, Steve Horvath was able to create a study with 9 individuals that were, for the first time, reversing epigenetic age in humans. And so science is getting results. We have this amazing researcher that is David Sinclair from Harvard that probably everybody in the world knows, that is also doing some studies related how DNA methylation can be interfered, or how sirtuins, the substance that are correcting and fixing our DNA and allow us to keep longevity, they are working. And this, the kind of substance like NAD+, it's also very important for sports or for our kind of athletes, because they can interfere as well in the maintenance of the quality of the cells, or the biogenesis of the mitochondria, or the related time of the tissues, or the decreasing in terms of quality of the tissues. So longevity is one of these areas that we take very serious and that we are working to get proper results in terms of the athletes. And then we have biohacking. And biohacking is something that people always associate with some weird guys doing some experiments, doing the Frankenstein or creating bombs or something like this. But biohacking is something that is growing up a lot. Since 2016, they have a summit that are participating all the best researchers in the world. And they are doing things like the Oura Ring, for example, or the Keto Mojo, or the Pnoe, or some of the devices that they're using today, they come from biohackers. So science decided around 2008, 2009 to be a little bit more free in terms of sharing with the normal people the capability to perform experiences, the way that science could have insights from people to have another ways to perform science that was not in labs, closed, full of ethics or full of rules, and they becoming science a little bit more free. So people started to do their own labs. They started to do their own experiences, and things started to think very simple things like knowing if the cereal you're eating is really the cereal you're eating, or the amount of toxic things on the cereal. But things started to get serious. So we have scientists from NASA and scientists that were leaving other big facilities and creating companies and doing some biohacking, some proper experimenting that could be able to be used by everyone. So biohacking is something that the athletes are using in terms of accessing another level of performance. So biohackers, basically, we can put everything like putting a chip inside of your body, creating an exoskeleton robot, or trying to change your microbiome, or optimizing your biomarkers in your blood, and everything with supplements or medication or things that could be experimenting. The lack of studies whatsoever were never a problem for athletes because that's why doping was generated. So as soon as the results start to come, people started to use biohacking in order to improve a little bit the performance and improve the performance to everything. So I guess it's all. I hope you guys enjoy it. From my side and my team, we thank this opportunity to be here sharing a little bit of our world. And Pedro, if you are there.
I'm here, Emiliano. Thank you so much. I am blown away. I must say that was an incredible lecture. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's very interesting because during this pandemic time, I am actually trying to look up into certain data that I wasn't exploring because I didn't have the time. And so I actually acquired a few wearables. I bought this a Huawei watch, a brand new, and I don't know if you've heard of this, the Aura Ring.
Yeah, I'm using one at the moment.
You have it as well.
Yeah, we're using one at the moment.
Exactly. To ask you about your take on the ring itself and the physiological parameters that it actually gives us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very good. The Aura Ring, the BioStrap, the Whoop, they are very reliable devices, and they allow us to have a huge amount of information. And nowadays, if you pay attention to the players, especially if you go to Formula One, for example, and if you look even to the pictures in their Instagram, you can see that almost all of them, they have Aura Ring because the trainers and the people are telling them to use.
And I see that more and more research is done on this little piece of tech, which is absolutely incredible, isn't it?
Yes. This like the Whoop, for example, that is crossing with Pnoe. The Pnoe is one of the first wearable devices that we can use to analyze the VO2 as a breath analysis, and that is accessible to everyone. Before of that, a device to do a breath analysis was costing around 60,000 euros. Now we can buy a Pnoe for 7,000. So all these things that allow us to give some high quality information can help us really to achieve better levels of performance, especially better levels of training or understanding the human body.
Great. Now we're going to turn to our audience's questions. Let's have a look at the first one. In just 1 second. Oh, let me just say before the question, I think this is important for our audience. I just remembered because this webinar, it won't be recorded. So it's really important that you guys stay with us for the rest of the webinar, okay? So we got the first question popping in. It's from Tiago Pereira. Can a reaction time test be a good or reasonable way to evaluate players' fatigue focus?
Hello, Tiago. Yes, it is if you do it under the right conditions. If you create a protocol and you're able to compare it, or for example, we use this kind of reaction tests when we do 24-hour races, for example, that the driver is resting very little, that the driver needs to be rested and then enter the car again. And we use it especially to know at the moment what is the capability of the athlete or if he's able to perform. So we do a first test in the beginning of the competition, and then through the night, every time that the guys are entering, we compare it with the baseline. So in terms of comparison with baseline, yes. In terms of comparison between people or between athletes, it's not very good. So that we have other interferences because the reaction test normally, if you do it inside of the test that you're doing, can be good. But if you change it to something else, for example, these apps that we can use on the phone or the lights that people like to train with, they may not have a direct relationship because the athlete is not engaged when he's doing the test with the task. And then he goes to competition and this part of the brain goes there and then he's able to perform. So we cannot, it's good as long as you are able to transport your competition to any kind of test or things that you're doing. But when you do these kind of things, we need to make sure that the athlete is doing always the same way. And this is not very, very reliable.
Thank you so much. Let's have a look at the next one. It's from Pedro Nunes. For you, what is the key to high performance to explore the full potential of an athlete? I think you covered that pretty much in your lecture.
Yeah, but if I have to choose one aspect of high performance, that's very easy because it's resilience. Resilience is what makes the high performance high performance. So we can go, I was talking about the new paradigms because I wanted to show people that things are going in a certain direction, or there are already people doing things in a certain way. And this can be transported to everyone, even a personal trainer giving a session to a special population. We can use some devices to measure, to access some other information. But in high performance, there's a key common thing between all high performance athletes, and that's resilience.
Emiliano, if you don't mind me saying, have you watched this new docu-series, The Last Dance?
Yes, I really enjoyed it.
Impressive, isn't it? You know, touching on this subject that you just talked about, the difference between amazing athletes and the exceptional ones, like the case of Michael Jordan, it's really impressive, and it's exactly what you mentioned.
Yeah, because it's very easy when you start to work with several athletes. They are a common path. It doesn't matter. It doesn't come from culture. It doesn't come from values. It doesn't come from personality. But there are some common path on everyone that's winning. That's why they are so little, because they are really achieving this kind of consistency, because they are really having this kind of profile.
Even our own Cristiano Ronaldo.
Of course, that's even another level.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Emiliano. We're going to bring our next speaker.
Thank you. Thank you.
In just a second. He's already ready to go. We just have a bit of a delay. Thank you so much, guys, for being with us. We really appreciate you coming in and watching this. This has been an exceptional time, and we really appreciate you being with us. Hello, Brandon. We need his sound. There he is. Brandon.
Hello, how's it going?
Hello, Brandon. Nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. Fantastic presentation.
I love your take on
your performance. It was brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish you a good lecture for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, once again, thank you so very much. I think I'm going to get in touch with you after this is over. It was a pleasure listening.
It's a pleasure.
You have so much to learn, and I hope to see you in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So Brandon is our next speaker. He comes from Canada. He is the CEO and founder of Strata International Performance and Drum Mechanics. He is also a muscle system specialist and exercise specialist educator. And today he will be speaking about rethinking warm-up intervention through post-activation potentiation preparation. Over to you, Brandon.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I really appreciate it. And there we go. So everyone, thank you so much and welcome to my presentation. I really appreciate your time. And honestly, Brandon, I've got...
you need to share your presentation with us.
Technical difficulties. Share screen. Share.
We got it.
We got it.
You need now you're going on full presentation mode. But we got it. Perfect. There you go. Off you go.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Pedro. So everyone, thank you so much for jumping in for this presentation. I really appreciate it. And what a fantastic group of professionals we've got today. These 6 people, they're just amazing. It's remarkable. So I feel like I've got some expectations to live up to with everyone that we're dealing with. So I am going to talk a little bit about this crazy phenomenon called post-activation potentiation, which is an a small piece of a course I developed called Post-Activation Potentiation Preparation. And my goal for today is to really get you to rethink your warm-ups, your interventions that you use pre-activity, and explore this PAP phenomenon, because there's something remarkable to it. And I'm looking forward to unfolding a little bit more as we get into my story. So many of you may not have heard of me before. I haven't met many of you at all. So I'd like to quickly just talk a little bit of who I am and why you should be listening to me for the next 25 minutes or so. So my name is Brandon Green. I'm from Canada. I've been working as a fitness and biomechanics specialist for about 15 years, my entire professional career. I've been teaching biomechanics and business skills to personal training and exercise professionals for about 10 years. I'm the owner and operator of my town's most successful one-on-one exercise studio called Strata Internal Performance. I'm a husband and a father. I'm a professional drummer, and I'm a nerd, probably like many of you. And this course came about really out of my own self-exploration. I work in a studio at Strata, and I work with professionals who are active aging, people with injuries, people who have had hip replacements, major traumas and diseases. And one thing that we do find is that exercise is one of the most amazing things that you can do with people. But I was doing all the different, I mean, as you know, there are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of different intervention strategies that you can experience, you can learn about, and use with your clients. What should you do? Should you rub muscles? Should you roll muscles? Should you ice muscles before activity? Should you stretch muscles? Should you just move the muscles? It's really confusing, and there are all these different companies teaching different philosophies around this. As such, I was doing a lot of these different techniques that involved passive intervention strategies, and some of them got great results, really great results. But these results did not stick around. These results didn't last all the time. I was finding that I have to redo the same rolling, the same rubbing, the same stimulating every single session. And it was frustrating. Frustrating for me and frustrating for my clients, because at the end of the day, the clients who are paying you money for the service to help them make them stronger, move better, and feel better, I mean, isn't it our diligence? Isn't it our responsibility to get them to where they want to be as fast, efficiently, and as safe as possible? This is where I resonate with the previous presentation about human performance and all these amazing technologies and different strategies for getting stronger, because ultimately there are a lot of amazing things that already happen within our body that allow clients to succeed. And if we can learn a little bit more about some of these small pieces, those frustrations, the lack of efficiencies, and perhaps the confusion around which technique, procedure, certification you should take, might not be so confusing. And so that's this PAP course. Now, full disclosure, the PAP preparation presentation I'm about to give you is a small chunk of a full one-day presentation with experimentation, using dynamometers to confirm and not confirm hypotheses, and do true experimentation as exercise scientists. So I'm hoping that this presentation shares a bit more insight into what the heck that we're doing and why I'm talking about this post-activation potentiation phenomenon. So the fundamental objectives that we're going to try to cover today is I want you to rethink preparation and warm-ups for exercise. Exercise, resistance training, performance. There are some amazing things that skeletal muscle can do. And so if we learn a little bit more about something that already exists, and many of you potentially have already heard about this post-activation potentiation, and yes, it's a long word. I'll be calling it PAP to make my life easier too. If we can rethink warm-ups and preparation, we can truly help to bias and optimize skeletal muscle for activity. And what's amazing, if you have measurement devices, EMGs and dynamometers, angular displacement devices, you can truly measure and check from a quantitative perspective rather than qualitative and subjective analysis, which are also important too. Through this, we're going to be introducing this PAP phenomenon and just talk a little bit more about it and some of the internal mechanisms that seem to be well documented relating to this phenomenon. One thing I'm going to do from a very introductory perspective today, I'm going to discuss some strategies to help you bias the PAP response to get more out of your skeletal muscle warm-ups, thinking about muscles. And I'll come back to why I'm talking about muscles. And I'm hoping that at the end of this presentation and any other subsequent presentations you take with me, that we evoke a thought process as unbiased scientific explorers. Remove the sunk costs, remove the biases of the company and the things that you're involved with. Can we really think about this body unbiasedly, which is hard? because ultimately we owe it to our clients to learn as much as we can from a scientific perspective to get more from their bodies. Now, here's one of the reasons why this presentation gets tough. And one of the reasons why it's tough to talk about these subjects is it's the Wild West in the exercise and fitness industry. Many of the presenters today are talking about scientific approaches, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of that. We've got lots of different ways for warming up, preparation, loosen, activate, stimulate, inhibit, and mobilize, right? Some basic and simple modes of warming up, which makes things confusing and very hard to know where to start, is should we foam roll? Should we manually rub or haptically stimulate tissue? Should we dynamically or ballistically stimulate? Should we do just isometrics? Should we stretch, active or passive? Should we just do some cardio to prepare? Should we do some abs? Some people just do core. Should we do some mobility drills, Theragun, electrical stimulation? And there's so much more. Many of you know, and many of you probably already do some of these things. And I will say this, the body is miraculous from a contraction perspective. And all these modalities, I guarantee you, in the right dosing with the right individual without causing any trauma, staying within their homeostasis, can make some amazing changes. But is it possible that we could be missing something and we could increase efficiency, rate of force development, and potentially active range of motion because of increased torque production by biasing certain mechanisms of these pieces? And in my philosophy and in my opinion, you can. But here's the problem, right? We're doing something, we're rolling people, we're stretching people, and we just say, but it works. Or your client goes, yeah, this is working fine for me, feel great. But here's the thing, what is happening with the inside view of the body? What is the internal performance? What are the internal substrates? What are we dealing with? What is it we're dealing with? And can we get past these cognitive biases like confirmation bias? Whole section of my course about this, and I'd love to talk more about it, but bias is one of the things that is limiting our ability as personal trainers to move forward as a field. I want this range of motion to increase from this rolling. I want this range of motion to increase from this stretching, this activating, this inhibiting, this ice. Can we learn more? So let's try and get past our biases. Unfortunately, no time to talk about that today. So what I want to share with you is a very simple analogy that I like to call the hamburger analogy. Because if we're putting force into the body, and pick any means that you want, whenever I take something and I push into my body, finger into skin, foam into skin, grab weight, mass, inertial-based device, or tension, and there's some resistance that is created within my body, a lot of stuff is happening. And so here's the problem, is a lot of these different techniques, you'll find say, well, this is a muscle technique. This is a smooth and cardiac muscle-based technique. This is a ligament stretch. This is a nerve flossing strategy. This is a fascial releasing technique. This is for joints, and this is for skin, and so many more. As you guys can see, I've got an old school, good old hamburger. Look at that hamburger. We got bun, tomato, bacon, cheese, potentially some onion, some beef, I think, cheese, lettuce, and bun again on top of some wood. And right next door to it, I got a piece, a cross section of some of the human body. We got skin, we got some adipose tissue, we got some superficial fascia, adipose tissue, more fascia, epimysium, and the muscle. So here's where I would like to challenge you, and this is a quick bit before we get deeper. Hamburgers and the human body, not much difference. If I were to take any sort of device, I don't want to pick on one thing, and I pushed into the top of the hamburger with my hand, are you telling me that you're biasing just one muscle, one fascia, one epimysium, one adipose tissue to release, stimulate anything? Here's the challenge. As you guys can see, if I pushed into the top of that hamburger, there's no way I could situate a dynamometer inside that hamburger to identify exactly how much force the piece of lettuce is taking, and also prove that the lettuce is the only thing that's taking the force. So when we say, well, I am working on your ligaments and no other tissue, I'm working on your muscles, your fascia, it is irresponsible to say this. Truly, it is not scientific, and there is almost no thought process here, especially if we're just going for it, because we're affecting so many things. If you've studied more advanced anatomy, you'll know that the sensory somatic system and the sensory receptors of the skin alone is remarkable. You could graze someone's skin, create an excitatory response, change the stimulation within the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and you can see an increase in excitation of the skeletal muscle and subsequent tissues in that same area, which means that rubbing someone's skin lightly can create amazing stimulations. We can't measure it. We can't measure it. And so all these things on the side here, you'll see I've labeled, right? Active or passive. Now, I should say voluntary active or voluntary passive, but all these systems here, which of these do we have voluntary immediate control over, right? We've absolutely got control of skeletal muscle. We can do angular displacement and move any part of our body, provided there isn't any nerve damage at any time. What about smooth and cardiac muscle? Because they're muscles too. No, we cannot voluntarily contract these. We can do things to make them to contract, but we can't voluntarily contract smooth or cardiac muscles. We can contract skeletal muscle that move our joints, but we can't do anything with our ligaments consciously. We can't make a voluntary change to our fascia or our nerves or our joints or our skin. All of these are sensory receptors or freeways of information to go either efferently or afferently to help our body respond. Skeletal muscle is the thing that we have voluntary immediate control over. And we can make amazing changes, understanding a little bit more about these phenomena that happen within skeletal muscle, as well as if we learn a little bit more about motor learning and how the body learns skills, open and closed skills, or however you want to talk about it. If your body, you understand how skeletal muscle learns, we've got these 3 principles of motor learning that we can discuss later, you can make changes. You can make amazing changes. And if you're looking for practical application, I mean, like I said, this is an abbreviated presentation for you to introduce these phenomena. But practically speaking, my personal training gym, my one-on-one exercise gym, we use this every single day. And this lets us get results with clients faster. And we can do shorter sessions. And we can decrease stress on bodies. And we can help more people with more advanced conditions, provided they're medically cleared for exercise. Just knowing more about skeletal muscle. It's all about skeletal muscle and physics. And we're not going to have time to talk about this today, but if you've studied some of the more advanced biomechanics course, you understand that physics and mechanics, understanding that is critical to make the optimal progressions, dosings, and understanding that when you apply force with someone's arm out to the side versus the side of their body, putting aside things like length-tension relationship, changes things. Rotational inertia, momentum, understanding these things, critical for optimal progression. So enough about all that introductory stuff. What about this post-activation potentiation? And why am I hanging my hat on this one phenomenon? Well, I will say that first and foremost, PAP is not something that is the only thing that's happening within our body. We should be talking about neuromuscular facilitation. We should be talking about common drive. We should be talking about motor learning and all these different components, biomotor configurationalism. But PAP, the reason why I'm talking about that is everything I'm going to say to you today are from previously researched papers. And you can find all this information academically, quantitatively, empirically, and rationally online to help you govern your thought process and your decision-making skills. So I definitely would say that as personal trainers and one-on-one exercise professionals, this is absolutely an unmeasured and unexplored variable for most. Now, some people do know this. Some people have heard of PAP. And in performance world, this is something that is explored as something that's a prerequisite, a contraction conditioning stimulus prior to exercise. And you can do some different little procedures, but often it's only talked about, at least in the world that I've been exploring, all the papers I've seen so far, and I'm happy to learn more, in the high performance world. If you're working with geriatrics, seniors, broken people, people who've had hip replacements, major surgeries, diseases, and they're cleared for exercise, I mean, this right here, there's some amazing information that based off of the body's history, you can make some amazing changes. So what is post-activation potentiation? So I've taken some dictionary definitions here and I've put a little, a brief and abbreviated Brandon Green version of the definition at the bottom, but we're going to look at some other authors' wordings and how they describe it in a moment here. So post-activation potentiation is an increase of the contractile effectiveness of skeletal muscle to subsequent contraction. So subsequent contraction means that there needs to be a post-activation response. There needs to be something that happens first to condition the body to be subsequently prepared for contraction. We should talk about that. But it's amazing. There's something about if you do something in the right order, whatever that means, and you stimulate the body can get better and more prepared for contraction. This makes sense. We've probably experienced this to some capacity. So another definition, if anyone would like the resources for these and the authors, most of these are, actually all of these are from my PAP preparation course. I'll be hosting an online version on June 13th. If you're interested, I have all the authors and citations in the back, so that way none of these are made up. So post-activation potentiation, PAP, also known as an activity-dependent potentiation, right? Potentiation, potential, there's something there, is an increase in the muscle isometrics in muscle isometric are series in evoked isometric twitch, staircase or trape. An evoked isometric tetanic contraction, post-tetanic potentiation, a sustained isometric maximal voluntary contraction, MVC, and a series of dynamic contractions. And this is my favorite line, why I've bolded it. In fact, any type of contractile activity is likely to activate the mechanism of PAP. Any type of contraction. A good friend of mine named Charlie McMillan, who's a brilliant exercise researcher and exercise scientist who uses this information, his decision-making as a scientist, shared some of this with me. I thought it was amazing, right? I was doing some techniques, much like many of you, procedures. And a part of my assessment process, the actual assessment itself, was eliciting small contractions and getting information, active range of motion displacement, and in some degrees I was using testing of skeletal muscle, some of that clinical kinesiology. And if you contract skeletal muscle in any degree, to any degree, you can elicit a PAP response. Now remember what I said, we got this thing right here, an increase of contractile effectiveness to the skeletal muscle. So if you're doing something and you're trying to measure how well skeletal muscle is performing with your hands or device, or how tight something feels by rubbing it or rolling it, is it possible that just you assessing that area is changing how that skeletal muscle is performing? And it is. If you cause pain to skeletal muscle, the sensory response of that area, there's a change in how that skeletal muscle performs. Perhaps optimally, perhaps not. We got to be careful here. Post-activation potentiation is induced by a voluntary conditioning contraction, CC, performed typically at maximal or near maximal intensities, and has consistently been shown to increase peak force and rate of force development during subsequent twitch contractions. So there's an interesting theme we got here. So we got one, if you elicit the PAP response, things get better. If you do it voluntarily and you use a conditioning contraction stimulus of some sort, especially near maximal intensity, there's an increase in both how much force a skeletal muscle can produce and how quickly it can reproduce, right? So peak force and rate of force development to subsequent contraction. Muscular performance is affected by the muscle's contractile history. Wait a minute. Contractile history? This is one of the reasons why I talk about this and explore this with the trainers at Strata Internal Performance so much, is if you're working with people on the lower end of the continuum, or someone who is in a rehab state, working back to a high performance state, contractile history. If someone has been more athletic, they've had phenotype adaptations where there's more fast twitch muscles, they perform better, they have someone who's learned skeletal muscle contraction skills. If you could stimulate this PAP response based off of their historical contractions, how their body has contracted in the past and adapted, you can get increased response because their body's already done this before. Most people have contracted more than they are contracting right now. Frankly, if you go down the stairs with any bit of speed and you are absorbing any of that force, the amount of force that's required to slow down the displacement down the stairs takes a lot of force. So if we can create a voluntary contraction, you might be able to actually bias this PAP response. So increased force development. Now there's some reasons why we're talking about that. The PAP response is a phenomenon by which the contractile history of the muscles directly affects their subsequent rate of force development and the ability to generate force in a rapid manner. Muscles, skeletal muscles, history, it matters. How fast you do this thing right, you're going to get an increased rate of force development and you're going to get more force. Now here's the last bit of this that we're going to talk about, right? Numerous mechanisms associated with PAP have been hypothesized. So look at all these things that they've been exploring for a long time, right? Including increased motor neuron activity, increased reflex electrical activity, enhanced blood flow to muscles, psychomotor enhancement, and increased myosin light chains, MLC, phosphorylation. There's a lot potentially connected with this. If you guys haven't heard about this, I think this is an interesting conversation for us to have. Now, here's the thing. So as we explore this post-activation potentiation phenomenon, and you can do your own research on this, and I urge you to, there are three proposed mechanisms. There's an increase of calcium sensitivity, or the myosin light chain phosphorylation. So how quickly the myosin head can get information to be thrown ahead to create a contraction. There's an increase in the H reflex, or the neural excitation, so how much information comes from the nervous system down to that skeletal muscle. And the third one, which is not as well documented, it's a modification to the pennation angle of the skeletal muscle, so there's an actual better opportunity for producing torque. So the actual orientation of the fibers can produce force tangentially perhaps better, but again, not well documented. So we have localized adaptations that happen from the PAP phenomenon, and we have neural adaptations that happen. Now, here's one of the things is if you don't have access to something like a dynamometer or something where you can actually measure force development in total newtons, or the net force rather, between the device and the user. There's immediate ways of seeing this. If you increase skeletal muscle, it is possible that you can increase the internal torque production of skeletal muscle, the force development and the rate of force development, and it seems to correlate with active range of motion. Now, we've got some, I think, N14 data here that we can actually look at. And it's amazing because there are so many connections to this PAP phenomenon, and we could talk about post-contraction sensory discharge, but common drive, coined by DeLuca and a few other folks. It seems that these observations of the common drive indicate when two antagonist muscles are activated simultaneously to stiffen a joint, right? So two muscles are contracting together. The nervous system views them as one unit and controls them in a like fashion. In this case, the homonymous motor neuron pool, the motor pool consists of the motor neuron pools of both muscles. Dealing with injuries, dealing with people with structural changes, because we have two components, very simplified, that we're dealing with when we're dealing with helping someone move, right? We have the actual skeletal muscle and the active contractile components, and then we have the joint requirements and the passive tissues. Well, the joints, the architecture of the joints actually allow me to do this thing, and are the muscles capable to pull me there, to produce enough torque and have the ability to contract in these positions based off where we are. And there's this isolation view of that, well, bicep is performing alone. Tricep is performing alone. We already saw when we talked about the hamburger that if we've got all these stacks of muscles, biceps, brachialis, brachioradialis, et al., all these elbow flexors, they're not working alone. But even furthermore, we have the hamburger, and we got two hamburgers, right? The front of the joint and the back of the joint. Common drive starts to talk about that it's not just co-activation. It's not just agonist and antagonist. It seems that the nervous system views things like triceps and biceps potentially as one muscle. Not entirely true, but it has one common homonymous motor neuron. How amazing is that? Now, from an injury perspective, if you've got someone who has arthritis, an advanced disease, let's say rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory conditions that are hard to manage and measure, that are changing. If someone's got a problem and they've got some damage to the anterior superior aspect of their shoulder, and you're trying to get them a little more mobility into horizontal abduction, instead of forcing it there and rubbing it and pushing it and stimulating it, what if it were possible just to teach those muscles to contract? But because we got damage here, right below myocromion, we got some damage, maybe even subacromial bursitis. If I actually stimulate the antagonist muscles based off of our very linear view of planes, is it possible that we could stimulate that muscle on the inferior aspect of that joint system and, based off of this common drive phenomenon, increase the force production and rate of force development of the antagonist, again, in that simple analogy, force production and rate of force development, and potentially see some range of motion changes? And it's entirely possible, which is another reason why I urge you to explore PAP. If you want to learn more about it, let me know. There's going to be a little document. I'll send it at the end of this. So a quick overview of PAP before we look at some data. I'll give you some very basic applications so you guys can start trying to experiment it. We got some amazing stuff in this short presentation. Post-activation potentiation seems to increase force production from subsequent contractions. If you get someone to contract in a strategic dose, we're going to talk about a CCS, they get better at contracting. There's some parameters we got to stay within. We're going to talk about at the bottom. It increases force development and rate of force development. It can increase torque, which can increase active range of motion. We got to use something like a voluntary contraction. You can use involuntary contractions, you'll see in the literature, but we want to make long-term changes based off of motor learning principles. Voluntary contraction seems to be optimal. It seems that, based off of the literature, that typically maximal or near maximal intensity is effective, but any activity will elicit the response. Response is influenced by contractile history. So what you have done in the past or what the person has done in the past matters. And it seems that any type of contraction potentially could stimulate the PAP mechanism, which means using contraction-based measurement tools can be tough unless you're actually thinking about what we're doing here. And there are two variables that absolutely influence how much excitation or common drive potentiation we can get, both of the sides of the joint system. We got fatigue and pain. And absolutely, fatigue, there's a declination in performance that happens subsequently as soon as you start fatiguing. So when we're doing this CCS dose, we're going to talk about in a second, Can't beat fatigue. And if you cause pain, well, the pain, the body doesn't like pain. It's the deep exploration of pain and nociception. You guys want to learn more about that? I mean, that's a complicated conversation itself there. So we're going to do two things to stay away and potentially accidentally not allow this PAP response to happen. We're going to stay away from fatigue. We're going to stay away from pain. You guys can see here, we're going to talk quickly about application of this thing called contraction conditioning stimulus. And you guys can see here one of the applications we use. I've got a microfet dynamometer here as a handheld one, and I've got a lot of different versions of it. We've got a Shimano version that we use, which is a little more technical engineering based. And frankly, if you guys want to start exploring, even luggage scales like this one that I got on Amazon with $60 Canadian. So it gets you exploring and collecting data quick. Now, if you don't have access to dynamometers and force measuring devices, you guys will see, well, I'll show you that in a second, which are important because it gives you a much more objective analysis to force development and number changes. We can actually start by measuring range of motion, because if we increase force production, both agonist and antagonist in skeletal muscle, we can see some amazing changes. Increased torque allows those muscles to pull further into the angular displacement of a joint. And given the resistance based off of the orientation of the limb and the weight of the limb, the center of the mass of the limb, if we can increase force production, we can make some amazing changes. So what we're going to do, and this is what we talk about and introduce a lot in the PAP preparation course, again, posting one on June 13th if you want to see it online, given COVID-19. We're going to talk about something called a contraction conditioning stimulus. So contraction conditioning stimulus, there's two different definitions of it, and I've kind of coined the CCS because it's been called a couple different things. The nature of a contraction conditioning stimulus used to induce PAP, right, the preparation for the PAP response, has been shown to have a significant effect on twitch potentiation. Intensity and volume of the PAP induced induction CC or CCS are known to play a relevant role in the subsequent twitch and performance behavior. It is commonly accepted that the PAP increases in response to increased contraction conditioning stimulus's intensity, and decreases as soon as the volume of the contraction conditioning stimulus starts to generate fatigue.
Hey, Brandon.
So, yep.
Just to let you know, we were almost, your time is almost up.
Perfect. I got 2 more slides and I'm done.
Go for it. Thank you.
So to button things up for everybody, lastly, I just want to show you that right here, I don't want this information to sound like a bias, and I'm trying to force this PAP thing down your throat. And this is a study performed by a good friend of mine, Charlie McMillan, with some real life data. You guys can see, if you guys want to see this, let me know. It's in the course that we're doing. Active range of motion increases when you potentiate folks. And after 1 MVIC, maximal voluntary isometric contraction, for a lot of people, force development changes and range of motion changes, and it's amazing. So you guys want to get started, and I'm sorry for taking up so much time. Here's what you do. Before an exercise, check the active range of motion of a movement. Pick a movement, chest press, try and do horizontal adduction as far as you can. Pick a couple different ways to contract that skeletal muscle using a contraction conditioning stimulus. Try and do 3 isometrics for 3 seconds, or try and do 3 concentric contractions for 80%. You can do isometrics for motion. Rest somewhere between 60 and 180 seconds. You can rest longer or shorter, but just see. And then recheck that range of motion and see if that range of motion changes. And if you'd like to put a force measuring device like a dynamometer in there, you absolutely can too. And lastly, stay within the Goldilocks zone. Don't push too hard. Don't push not hard enough. Want to avoid pain and fatigue. Goldilocks zone like Earth. We're in this perfect mixture between not too hot, not too cold. So no matter what, PAP mechanism is occurring when skeletal muscle is involved. So guys, there's a lot of things I want to talk about here. Lastly, if you guys do this right, these adaptations in force production, changes in range of motion, contractions, and how it helps somebody move, there's a lot of evidence that it could be long-term changes. So if anybody here wants to learn more, I'll be sending a document out through the school here on June 13th. I'll be hosting an online version. And if you guys sign up before May 23rd, I'll be giving you guys a $150 discount to get in. And honestly, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If anything, I hope this conversation gets you guys thinking about things a little bit differently, and ultimately gets you thinking about this post-activation potentiation response.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was great. Post-activation potentiation is a whole new world to be explored, and you are the guy for this. And guys, if you are interested, please subscribe to the course. I really couldn't recommend it more. We're going to send out an email to everyone who is interested. Thank you so much, Brandon. And now we're going to move on to our questions. We've got a question from one of our speakers, from João Lapad, our first speaker. He was really interested because he uses isometrics a lot in his practice, as we've heard. And his question is there a difference between post-activation potentiation and priming? I don't know if you've heard of this term, priming.
That's a great question, and I'm sorry I wouldn't be able to answer very accurately scientifically because I'm not familiar with the word priming, at least from an academic sense. But it is possible that they're both occurring at the same time. I mean, anytime you contract the skeletal muscle, this PAP response is happening, excitation is happening, and priming could be a synonym for something else. And I'm sorry that I missed your presentation. I would love to hear how you use isometrics in your practice. But I'll tell you what, my email will be at the end of this. If you want to email me, we can chat more privately. I would be happy to.
I think it would be great for you guys to talk about that because you have so much in common in your own practices. João also uses a lot of isometrics in his practice, and I think it'd be a great way for you guys to share knowledge in that subject.
Would love that. Thank you.
Now we're gonna start. I'm gonna start with the questions from the audience. So we got one from our student and our friend Pedro Gandaio, and he asks how long you think gains can keep after post-activation potentiation. I believe it's how much the potentiated effect lasts.
So there's a quick, a little bit of an expansive answer, but I think you guys will like it. So Pedro, hi, nice to meet you. Thanks so much for the great question. So post-activation, we are talking about two things. There's motor learning phenomenon, and then there's actually the actual potentiation learning phenomenon. Motor learning, we have three phases. We have a cognitive step, an associative step, and autonomous step. So how the client or the person interprets it, also based off their contraction history, all of absolutely matter. But you guys can do your own research on this, but there was something called short-term potentiation and long-term potentiation, and it's not exclusive to skeletal muscle or performance. It's more of a cognitive, there's a lot of literature on how the brain learns. So short-term potentiation could be minutes, hours, days, or weeks, and long-term potentiations on the longer end of the continuum could be longer, could be months. Frankly, if you've ever exercised and you're constantly bench pressing 200 pounds, and you go on vacation for a week, and you return to that 200 pounds and you haven't bench pressed in maybe 2 weeks, and you pick up that same weight and it feels heavier, harder, and awful, that like, oh, did I get weaker? You still have the potentiation of that skeletal muscle and you to bench press 200 pounds. You didn't lose that muscle. It's just how much information is going at that given time. So potentiation, you are already, if you're an exerciser, long-term potentiated. As long as you practice this and you practice the law of repetitive effort, you do it in strategic doses, it can last a very long time. And then all of a sudden it becomes adaptation. So Pedro, really can't answer that question, but if you do it in the right dosing consistently, you can get long-term exponential adaptation, chronic adaptation.
Awesome, Brandon. We got another one coming up. It's from Ricardo Batista, and he asks, is there a chronic effect in active range of motion? That's a great question.
Is there a chronic effect in active range of motion? Ricardo, I don't, there's a couple different ways we could go with this. I would say potentially for sure, right? With all things that we do with the body, both on a pain stimulus and stimulating the body response, there is an acute and chronic effect. And if someone explores active range of motion enough times, there are active contraction components that are associated with it. It's one of the reasons why in practice we use no passive stimulus, it's all active stimulus. So if you're doing active range of motion and you consistently explore aggregate shoulder flexion, you go to 180 degrees over and over again, yes, there can be a chronic effect, because when you do it for the first time or you nudge into that new 5 degrees of motion you've never experienced actively before, there's an acute effect. And you do it enough times, depending on the individual, their age, their status, their contraction history, it could stay chronically for, it depends on how quickly that adaptation happens. So the answer would be absolutely yes, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
It's really hard to answer, isn't it? Because there's so many factors involved in it.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Brandon. We're going to bring Mr. Charlie Cates to webinar.
What's up?
There he is.
Charlie Case, how's it going?
Great to see you, man. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. It's great to see you too.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm glad to hear it.
Nice meeting you, Charlie.
Yeah, great to meet you, Pedro.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Brandon, thank you so much once again, and I hope to see you soon. Take care.
Pedro, thank you so much. Everyone, quickly, there'll be a document with some accompanied YouTube videos. So if you want to learn more and start applying it right away, check the link and sign up, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Charlie, have a great one, man. Break a leg.
Great presentation, man. Well done.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to introduce you, Charlie. So,
right.
so Charlie comes from the United States of America. He holds a master in exercise science. He's a muscle activation specialist, instructor, and a personal trainer. Today, he will be presenting on the subject of how exercise promotes longevity. Charlie, we are delighted to have you. And now I turn it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Pedro. I'm really excited to be here. And happy Saturday, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here.
For a second. You need to share your presentation with us.
Let me do that right now. Share screen.
Now we'll accept it.
Share screen. And let's go application. Let's go that one. Perfect. Are we
full screen? Go on presentation mode.
Are we better with that?
Yep, we're going. We're rolling.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, happy Saturday, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I'm really excited to be talking with you all today. You know, one of my things with exercise.
Sorry, Charlie, you need to go in presentation mode. Sorry.
No, that's my error. Presenter view.
No, your presentation mode is that. It's down below. No. Click on your right bottom side.
This.
Okay. It needs to go full screen.
Full screen. Okay. So is that full screen there?
Just a second. It didn't go.
It didn't go? Dang. View format. PowerPoint edit. Center view presentation mode. Presentation. Reduce size password properties.
That's not PowerPoint, is it?
It is PowerPoint, yes, sir.
Okay. There should be a button there for presentation mode. So you can just click on your computer to move the slides to go full screen.
And that's not coming up. It's full screen on my side, but is it not coming through?
No, it's not coming through.
Oh darn.
Is it full screen on your side?
Yes, sir.
Would you please come off of your presentation and open it again?
Yep.
So try it out.
Sure. Yeah. Let me close that out and then we'll reopen it for you.
Then share it again with us.
Sure thing. Okay. Let's try this again.
Sorry, guys. This will just take a second.
That one. Great. Okay, so let's go this, share screen. Share screen. Share, and then let's go here. There. Is that coming up now?
Yeah, it's going.
Okay, we're good to go. You can see that first slide?
Perfect. Thank you. It's
all
perfect.
right. Fantastic. Hey, thanks for your patience. Thanks for helping me with that. All right. So, you know, what I want to talk about today, obviously, is more the health aspect of exercise, because to me, the health aspect is really where the true value in exercise lies. Okay, because you know there are so many amazing benefits that can come from exercising. from changing how your body looks and feels to increasing your strength and even improving the function of your brain. And one thing that we often hear about exercise is that exercising can help us to live longer. But what does this mean and how does it happen? And most importantly, can any way of exercise help us to live longer, or should we be exercising in a very specific manner? So first of all, let's discuss this idea of living longer. If we're going to live for a long time, what would need to happen? Well, to keep things simple, let's break this down to three categories. First, we'd want to minimize the number of random or acute negative events that happen, such as getting struck by lightning. Number two, we want to be able to maximize the positive functions of our body. We'd want our body working as optimally as it could on as many levels as it could. And number three, we'd want to be able to minimize the chronic negative deterioration that's happening within our body. We'd want to be able to reverse damage that has happened. We'd want to be able to manage damage that is currently happening. And we'd want to be able to prevent new damage from starting. So if something's going to help us live longer, we would want it to be able to do at least one of these three things. Minimize the random or acute negative, maximize the positive, and minimize the chronic negative. Now, while all three of these categories are somewhat out of our control, exercise can highly influence the latter two, making exercise a strong candidate for helping us to live longer. But again, what is meant by this idea of maximizing the positives and minimizing the chronic negative? What's happening within our cells with each of these, and how does exercise actually influence this? So there are a number of hypotheses out there about what contributes to aging and longevity. I'm going to discuss four main ones today that have gained a lot of press and attention over the years. And the first one is this idea of mitochondria. All right, now, as you're very well aware, I'm sure mitochondria are the main energy producer of the cell and are often considered to be the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, mitochondria utilize oxygen in the production of energy, which is called aerobic production of energy, which also is not to be confused with exercises that are labeled as more aerobic in nature, such as running or cycling. In order for our cells to complete all their necessary tasks, we need them to produce sufficient amounts of energy. And if they're not able to produce sufficient amounts of energy, then they're not going to function well and they're going to get sick. So if we're going to live for a long time, we need to make sure that our cells can produce sufficient amounts of energy to complete all the necessary tasks. But then we also need to make sure that our body has the ability to clean up and clear out damaged cells. Now, this process within our body called autophagy is vital to ensuring that chronic disease and illness does not develop. In fact, when damaged cells start to accumulate, that's when chronic disease starts to develop. So if we're going to ward off chronic disease and illness, we need to make sure that our body has the ability to clean up and clear out damaged cells through this autophagy process. Additionally, we want to make sure that our body has the ability to replace damaged cells with healthy new ones. And this is where cellular division and replication comes into play. When cells divide and chromosomes replicate, something on the end of the chromosome called the telomere gets a little bit shorter. Now, you may be familiar with this idea of telomere shortening as being a contributing factor to aging. Unfortunately, our telomeres can only get so short before they won't go any further, at which point our chromosomes won't divide, our cells won't divide, our chromosomes won't replicate, and it appears that we will lose the ability to replace damaged cells with healthy new ones. So again, if we're going to live for a long time, we want to make sure that our telomeres stay as long as possible for as long as possible. And then finally, we want to make sure that our healthy cells stay protected from chronic attack, specifically from reactive oxygen species, or ROS. Now, reactive oxygen species are the #1 initiator of all chronic health conditions out there, from heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and dementia. So it is vital to ensuring, if we're going to live for a long time, to make sure that our cells stay protected from this chronic attack from the reactive oxygen species. So to recap, if we're going to live for a long time, we want to make sure that our cells can produce sufficient amounts of energy, our body can clean up and clear out damaged cells, our body can replace damaged cells with healthy new ones, and our body can protect those healthy cells from chronic attack. The question now is, can exercise help with any of this? So when it comes to mitochondria and exercise, this is something that exercise is very well known for. Resistance training, higher intensity interval training, and lower intensity cardiovascular activity have all been documented to increase the health and density of mitochondria in humans. What's really neat is the thing that starts to stimulate the mitochondrial production is a byproduct of muscle contraction, which means the more muscles contract, the more intensely muscles contract, the more frequently muscles contract, and the longer muscles contract for, the more these byproducts get produced, and the more mitochondrial production occurs. So can exercise help to stimulate mitochondrial production, allowing our cells to continue to produce sufficient amounts of energy to complete all their necessary tasks? Absolutely. With autophagy, there appears to be 4 main ways in which this happens, and all through the activation of various proteins and enzymes. Now, these proteins and enzymes have a number of roles within our body and do some really neat things within our body, including improving insulin sensitivity, decreasing inflammatory molecules, regulating the metabolism of the cells, and helping our cells divide, in addition to starting this autophagy process. So having these proteins and enzymes activated is a really important thing for our overall health and well-being. What's neat is the thing that initiates the activation of these proteins and enzymes is, again, the byproducts of muscle contraction, which means the more muscles contract, the more intensely muscles contract, the more frequently muscles contract, and the longer muscles contract for, the more these byproducts get produced, the more these proteins and enzymes get activated, the more we get these whole slew of amazing health benefits, and the more autophagy occurs. So can exercise help to stimulate the autophagy process, allowing our body to continuously clean up and clear out damaged cells, helping to ward off chronic disease and illness? Absolutely. Now, with telomeres in exercise, what's pretty interesting about this is actually moderate intensity exercise appears to be what's best for protecting and lengthening telomeres. And this is done through the activation of an enzyme called telomerase. Now, the thing that stimulates telomerase activity is, again, the byproducts of muscle contraction. So we might sit there and think, well, then the more muscles contract, the more intensely muscles contract, the more frequently muscles contract, and the longer muscles contract for, the more telomerase activity there will be, and the better protected and the longer our telomeres will become. And while there's validity to this line of thinking, the risk that's associated with really high intensity exercise is that muscle damage can occur. And when cells get damaged, they either have to be repaired or replaced. And if it's the latter, that means healthy cells have to divide, chromosomes have to replicate, and the telomeres get a little bit shorter. So there appears to be this sweet spot with moderate intensity exercise, where we get enough telomerase activity to both protect and lengthen the telomeres, but we don't run the risk of creating muscle damage that's often associated with super high intensity exercise. So can exercise help to protect and lengthen our telomeres, allowing our healthy cells to continuously divide, our chromosomes to replicate, and our body to have the ability to replace damaged cells? Absolutely. Finally, when it comes to protecting our healthy cells from chronic attack from reactive oxygen species, again, we need to remember that reactive oxygen species are the #1 initiator for all chronic health conditions out there, from heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and dementia. What's really neat, though, about our bodies is our body has its own internal antioxidant production system. And this is done to be able to combat the production of the reactive oxygen species and help to protect our cells. The thing that stimulates the production of antioxidants is, again, the byproducts of muscle contraction, which means the more muscles contract, the more intensely muscles contract, the more frequently muscles contract, and the longer muscles contract for, the more these byproducts get produced, the more antioxidant production stimulation occurs, or the more the initiation, rather, of the antioxidant production occurs, and the better protected our cells become from reactive oxygen species. The thing to understand, though, about protecting our cells from reactive oxygen species and stimulating antioxidant production within our body is that exercise needs to be done on a frequent basis. In fact, animal studies have shown that 1 day of inactivity leads to decreased insulin sensitivity, while human studies have shown changes in cardiac function, LDL to HDL ratio, as well as decreased insulin sensitivity within 3 days of bed rest. So if we are going to get this protection of our cells by producing more antioxidants through exercise, then we need to be exercising on a frequent basis. So again, can exercise help to protect our cells from chronic attack from reactive oxygen species that would otherwise lead to chronic health conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and dementia? Absolutely. The question now is, well, how should we be exercising in order to gain all the longevity boosting benefits that can come from exercise? Now, while there's no one-size-fits-all plan, and everybody that you're working with should be consulting with their physician before beginning any exercise program, the literature we discussed today would suggest a daily exercise routine that's performed at one of 3 intensity levels. Now, having reviewed a lot of the literature myself, including 66 papers for this presentation alone, my professional recommendation is as follows. Exercise needs to be done every single day at one of 3 intensity levels. Low intensity, which is approximately 55% of your maximum heart rate or effort. Medium intensity, which is done at approximately 70% of your maximum heart rate or effort. And high intensity, which is done at approximately 85% or above of your maximum heart rate or effort. A maximum of 3 days per week of lower intensity exercise should be performed, while a minimum of 2 days per week of both medium intensity and higher intensity exercise should be performed. You can always level up and do more of the higher intensity days in lieu of fewer of the lower intensity days, but you cannot skip out on the higher intensity days and just do the lower intensity days. A minimum of 20 minutes of exercise needs to be done every single day, with a minimum of 2 days per week of resistance training and 2 days per week of cardiovascular-based exercise performed. Now, when we think of exercising and when our clients think of exercising, a lot of times we think about the benefits of exercising. And then we take those benefits and we weigh them against what we're currently doing. And we decide, okay, well, how much do I actually want those benefits versus what I currently am doing? And then I go out and I decide whether or not I want to exercise. But we need to understand that there's actually a tremendous cost to not exercising. In fact, a paper released in October of 2018 showed that consistent inactivity and consistent low levels of physical activity are more detrimental to human health and longevity than heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and even smoking. This means that by consistently choosing to skip workouts, not only are you missing out on all the amazing health benefits that can come from exercise, you're actually doing more detriment to your health long term than if you were to develop heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, or start the habit of smoking. But there's good news. The good news for each of us is that it's never too late to start. In fact, a paper released as recent as March of 2019 showed that adults who had been sedentary for the majority of their lives could still glean longevity boosting benefits from exercise, even when they began the habit as late as their 60s. Furthermore, there appears to be no upper known limit to the amount of benefit you can get from exercising, with those who are in elite physical condition having over a 10 times reduction in all-cause mortality versus those who are in low levels of physical condition. And by going from a low level of physical condition to a below average level of physical condition, you cut your rate of all-cause mortality in half. Now, this is huge. Remember, the goal of exercising for your health and longevity is not to try to get you to live to be 150 years old, nor is it to get you to live into old age, but have to be physically dependent on others. The goal of exercising for your health and longevity is to ward off illnesses that could easily turn fatal, as well as to get you to, rather allow you to be able to do all the things in life that bring you joy for as long as you want to do them. As one of our podcast guests has said, I know 80-year-olds in nursing homes, and I know 80-year-olds on golf courses. The research that's coming out shows that the research that's coming out shows that the difference between the two is only minorly contributed to by your genetics, with the overwhelming majority contribution being how your lifestyle choices affect the expression of your genetics. Getting your clients to exercise, to make that lifestyle choice to exercise on a daily basis will not only add more days to their life, but add more life to their days. I want to invite you and I want to encourage you to continuously have discussions with your clients about the importance of exercising for their health, for their longevity, for their well-being, and to continue to encourage them to exercise on a consistent basis. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing within all of our communities, and for being here today so I could share this message with you. And stop sharing.
Hey, Charlie.
What's up, Pedro?
You have finished, right?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Because I saw it go down. I was
okay.
if you have finished or not. Thank you so much. That was really good. I mean, it shows us a side of what people actually don't appreciate, because everyone's talking about this longevity, but it's in details, which some of them are really complex, but helps us understand of how valuable this profession is actually to improve the benefits of people.
Exactly. And that's really where I think, from a profession, if we can get that idea out there that, yes, being able to run faster, jump higher, lift heavier weights, that's important, that's fine and well. But if we can get people to be able to do that for an extended period of time in their life because they're living longer and they're healthier overall, there's a ton of value to that.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes the fitness industry is a bit too much, I would say, focused on the athletic population, and from the overall population, only 2% would reach an athlete level. So we have so much to experience through through exercise to improve people's lives.
Yep, exactly.
Charlie, we're going to move on to our audience's questions, and we got a question coming up.
Okay.
It's from Tiago Pereira from Portugal, and he asks, today with the pandemic caused by COVID-19, will you recommend high-intensity training or low-intensity training to improve our immune system? I think that's a very good question.
It's a very good question. It's very relevant. Okay, so here's the thing: is I think first and foremost, we always need to consider who we're talking to. All right, what's going to be appropriate for them. And so some people just really can't tolerate super high intensity training. So their best option is going to be to do lower intensity training. Now, if you are doing higher intensity training, you also need to make sure that you're giving your body enough time to recover so you can continue to do that. So I'm thinking about this in one of two ways. One, what's appropriate for the person that they can keep it up, and two, what's going to allow them to come back day after day and continue to exercise. Is there benefit to both? Absolutely. But I think really what I'd recommend for the individual, we need to get an individual in front of us. And so I would kind of talk with the individual about the benefits of both, and making sure above all else that they are continuing to exercise. And as long as they can tolerate it, start to implement some higher intensity training, but then making sure that we're still, even on the days where they're not training intensely, they're still getting some activity in, some lower intensity cardiovascular based training in order to stimulate our cardiovascular system, making sure that that stays healthy and that stays strong through these times.
I mean, we still don't know the overall effects of this new virus, this SARS-CoV-2, which causes the disease COVID-19. But still, we know from research that exercise has a protective effect. Even though we don't know the full extent at the moment with this new disease, I think we can use it as a preemptive measure.
Yes. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. My father's a physician, and so every Sunday I talk with him about the things that he sees in his office. And, hands down, the fewer comorbidities somebody has, the better they seem to be doing with, with being able to tolerate if they themselves end up getting infected. And so it's like, okay, well, then what can we do to just improve people's health overall, right? And so if we can trend them towards that, then overall that's going to give us a better chance of fighting this thing.
Awesome. We got another question coming up. Just a second. And this question comes again from Portugal, from Anabela Coelho. And she asks, most people are training at this time at home. Which kind of training do you recommend? I think this is a very good question.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think, again, just working, because speaking with the clients that we work with, what we find that a lot of people default to when they are working out at home is they tend to default to more cardiovascular based exercise, and that's totally fine and well. But remember, we need to get some resistance training in to try to stimulate our muscles so they can better support our joints, so we can keep doing the cardiovascular based activity. So that being said, what would I recommend if somebody's working out at home? Definitely trying to get in movement every single day, whether that's, going out for a light walk, whether that's going out for a run, but then also looking to get some kind of resistance training in. And if all you have is body weight, there's a lot of opportunities to do just simply body weight exercise to keep your strength up. Okay. There's a lot of options of workouts that you can look up on YouTube. I know from our Facebook page, we do a broadcasted workout every single day on our Facebook Lives, and we have all the replays up. So that's an option for people. But, just looking for, body weight routines or something like that, where you can, whether it's push-ups, squats, hip bridges, planks, different things to just try to improve your strength during this time. And then also being able to go out and do some of the cardiovascular based exercise. What I see happen too often is when we're at home, we default to just a cardio, we end up starting to lose our strength. And when that happens, our joints become less supported, and a lot of the orthopedic issues that were once at bay can start to creep up again.
Perfect, Charlie. I think that sums it up really well. We got another one coming up. Just 1 second. And this one is from one of our certificate students, Ana Alexandra from Porto. And she asks, in your experience, what works better with your clients? Motivated by the risk of develop illness, or by inspiration of the wellness he can achieve? This is a pretty complex question.
It's a great question, and I think it's super applicable. So I think it in part depends on kind of their family history and their personal health history. All right, I have some clients that come in and they're like, my dad had a heart attack, my uncle had a heart attack, my grandpa had a heart attack, and so for them, avoiding that is a really positive thing. For other people, they're saying, hey, you know what? My kids are starting to have kids, which means, I have grandkids. I want to be there for a while to make sure that I can keep doing all these things. Or another thing that we hear is their friends are starting to get so old. Like, oh, I go out with my friends and my friends can't do anything because they have all these aches and pains. So I want to make sure that I can keep doing all the stuff that I like to do. So I don't think it's exclusively one or the other. I think depending on somebody's health history, their family health history, and what you know of them as far as what they like to do, you can play both sides with them and see what resonates better. But I think having those kind of conversations with them from a long-term perspective, look, getting somebody to come to you for, 4 to 6 weeks so that, they can drop some weight before their wedding or something like that, sure, that's fine and well. But it's really cool when you can keep somebody on for, 4 to 10 years. And then now all of a sudden you have a recurring client, you have a recurring business as well, and you're able to see them through different stages of life, and help them with those things that they want to do.
And now online training is really booming, isn't it? I was I must say I was a bit skeptical, but I had to adapt to even still with some of my clients, and for them it was really important to keep them motivated in a certain way. You don't have the tools, but it was actually a great way to reinvent ourselves in terms of what we can do with people and explore other forms of training, especially isometrics, range of motion. I think it was
absolutely. There's for sure. No, to your point, online training, obviously, a lot of people are resorting to that right now. And I think at some levels it can be done really well. And at some levels it's done not as well. But I think the value in that is, especially at this point in time, look, I would rather have somebody train with me online than not work out. Like if that's my option, right? And so the only way they're going to get instruction from me at this time is online. Now, once we go back and we can open up our business, cool, we're back to in person again. But given the time that we're at, we got to make the best do with what we have. And I cannot, in good conscience, tell my clients, oh, you know what? Take the next 10 weeks off of exercise. I'll see you when you get back. That I can't do that. So, given what we have right now, we say, hey, you know what? Join us for these workouts, and it keeps them moving, and then we can get more fine-tuned from there.
Absolutely. That's exactly the way I see it. Thank you so much, Charlie. We really appreciate you here talking to us. And we're going to bring Dr. James Fisher, which will be our next guest. Hi, James.
Hi, Pedro. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you. How are you?
Very good. Thank you. Charlie,
hey, Dr.
fantastic
Fisher.
presentation.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Charlie, once again, thank you very much. I hope to see you very, very soon.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
So our last speaker is Dr. James Fisher. He comes from the United Kingdom. He holds a Bachelor in Sports Science from the University of Chester. He's a Master in Exercise Physiology, which he has taken from Manchester Metropolitan University. And he has a PhD from Nottingham Trent University. Presently, he's a researcher and professor at Southampton Solent University. And he will be with us today to talk about the strength endurance continuum revisited. Dr. James Fisher, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much.
Please share your presentation with us.
Okay, can you guys see that now?
Yeah. Yep, it's coming up. You're on. Thank you.
Fantastic. So first of all, thank you very much, Pedro and Hugo and EXS. This is a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic event. So thank you very much. My presentation today is titled The Strength Endurance Continuum Revisited. And it's geared around one of our recent publications, which I'll let everybody know about towards the end of the presentation. But really, this lends itself quite nicely to the current topic of what sort of weight or sort of load should we be training with. And the existing dogma, the existing accepted wisdom within strength training is that for maximal strength increases, we should be using a very heavy load, greater than 85% of one repetition maximum, and somewhere around 6 repetitions or less. For a moderate load to increase muscle mass, we should be using sort of 67 to 85% of one rep max, somewhere between 6 and 12 maximal repetitions. And a light load is optimal for muscular endurance, somewhere greater than 12 repetitions. And this has repeatedly been cited by the ACSM and the NSCA, and they're the most recent citations listed there. Now, the reason I say this is quite contemporary is because many people at their home don't have very, very heavy weights. So it would be wrong of them to think that they're only improving their muscular endurance if they use very light weights. So let's have a bit of a look at all of this. Firstly, this is the table that we normally see, and this is actually from the NSCA textbook. We can see the lower rep ranges for strength, moderate rep ranges for hypertrophy, and higher rep ranges for muscular endurance. So actually, the aim of this presentation is firstly to review some of the citations that actually underpin these claims. And then what I want to do is talk about some of the problems that have been inherent in developing this strength and endurance continuum, and maybe start to dismantle it a little bit. And then we'll talk a bit about the contrasting evidence, maybe some of the research that supports a strength and endurance continuum. And then we'll look at some of the practical elements as well. So hopefully we'll get through all of that in time. So the first thing is, when we look at this table, you would expect that since this has been the accepted wisdom in strength and conditioning and personal training for a long time, that that there would be a lot of support for this, but actually there really isn't. And in fact, if we go to the main sources, there are really only 8 citations that the National Strength and Conditioning used to support this table. Of those 8 citations, 2 of them are textbooks, 1 is a chapter from a book, and 2 are commentary or recommendation articles. So none of those 5 references are actually empirical studies. And this in itself is a bit of a problem, because without an empirical study that shows that optimal strength gains are achieved with lower repetitions or so forth, we really can't build much on these claims. So let's look at the other 3 citations. Well, the first is a very often cited study by Richard Berger from 1962. And he divided nearly 200 males, college-aged males, into groups where they trained from anywhere between 2 RM to 10 to 12 repetition maximum. So they trained with very heavy weights at 2 RM or more moderate weights in the 4 to 6 and 6 to 8 rep max, and then with much lighter weights in the 10 to 12 repetition maximum. And actually what he found was that the group that trained with the 10 repetition maximum actually made the greatest strength increases. So greater even than the group that trained with very heavy weights, and greater than those that trained with lighter weights. So that doesn't support the idea of the need for very heavy weights to increase strength. The next study was a study by Herrick and Stone from 1986, and they used untrained females, again collegiate females, and they divided them into 2 groups, and one group did what they called a progressive resistance exercise program, and the other group did what they called a periodized resistance training program. And ultimately, they actually found no significant difference in the strength increases between the 2 groups. So again, there's certainly no evidence there to support the need for heavy weights for strength, moderate weights for hypertrophy, or lighter weights for endurance. And then the final of the 8 citations, the final of the 3 empirical studies, was this study by Tesh and Larson in 1982. And the first thing that we should look at is this was actually an observational study. And what we mean by that is that they recruited people and they took acute measurements, but they really had no evidence of what they'd been doing before those measurements were taken. Now, 3 of the participants were competitive bodybuilders, so they were clearly very muscular, but we didn't really have any evidence of their pre-existing training routines. But they compared some of the data to physical education students and also to national weightlifters. And the key thing with this is they took some biopsies. So they looked at muscle size is the key in this. And actually they reported, and I've put the quote straight up there, they didn't observe any sign of individual muscle fiber enlargement in either thigh or shoulder muscles of successful bodybuilders. So basically, even though that they had built this premise that the bodybuilders were doing a certain kind of workout, but they couldn't prove it, or that the weightlifters were doing another kind of workout, they couldn't differentiate between them in muscle fiber size. So again, that doesn't support the claim that heavy weights are needed for strength, moderate weights for hypertrophy, or lighter weights for muscular endurance. So straight away, the foundations start to look a little bit shaky for this. Okay, now if we look at the strength endurance continuum, then I've identified 4 key problems that we're going to talk about. And the first of which is simple misinterpretation. So the picture on the bottom right of the screen is Captain Thomas DeLorme. Now, Thomas DeLorme really is the founding father of progressive resistance exercise. And I've even shown the screen, the image from the front of his paper from 1948. So in 1945, he was looking at rehabilitating injured war veterans. So first thing is, we can't consider this research to be empirical studies on well-trained males or powerlifters or bodybuilders. It's rehabilitation for injured war veterans. Now, what he did is he compared what he called power building exercises, where participants used a heavy resistance for a low number of repetitions, to endurance building exercises, where they performed a large number of repetitions with a very low resistance. And now that seems to make sense based on what we think is the strength and endurance continuum. But actually, we should clarify that he wasn't looking at low resistance, high repetition as light load resistance training. he was actually making reference to stair climbing, walking, bicycling, and similar low resistance exercise. So things that we've commonly now perceive as endurance exercise. So he was never actually comparing heavy and light weights for resistance training. He was simply comparing resistance training to endurance exercise. And he makes that very clear as he goes through his series of studies. Now, in actual fact, in 1948, he decided that the term heavy resistance exercise was off-putting for a lot of people. And he says there, it bears false implications. And so he coined the term progressive resistance exercise. And that's what we now know today, progressive resistance exercise. Now, he had a couple of other comments, which I think are noteworthy. The first from 1945 here is he says, the movements should be done smoothly, rhythmically, and without haste, and quick or sudden motions while exercising should be avoided. He also looked at the volume of training, and in 1945, he suggested somewhere between 7 and 10 sets per exercise. But by 1948, he had changed that to 3 sets of 10 repetitions, which is probably very familiar to a lot of people. Now, it's worth noting that in his 1948 paper, he suggests that the 10 repetitions should be performed at 50% of the 10 repetition max, then at 75% of 10 repetition max, and then at 100% of the 10 repetition max. So really, this is 2 warm-up sets, 2 progressive warm-up sets, and then a single set to momentary failure. And that was how the original concept of 3 sets of 10 repetitions began. So it's interesting to see the origins of that 3 sets of 10. Now, the next problem is consistency. So, and I've cited one of my own papers here from 2017. So the title is at the top of the screen there, High and Low Load Resistance Training, Interpretation and Practical Application of Current Research Findings. Now, one of the reasons we wrote this paper was because there was a lot of studies coming out that talked about heavy loads being better for motor unit recruitment. But in fact, they were talking about synchronous recruitment, not sequential recruitment. So ultimately, that if a set is taken to momentary failure, then there is sequential motor unit recruitment until all motor units and the muscle fibers connected are recruited. Now, the only difference here is that if we lift a heavy weight, then we can practice the skill of lifting that heavy weight. And that's something called a motor schema, or in English, it's a motor schema. So we're actually practicing the skill. So if you're working with a power lifter, where they do heavy single maximal lifts for the bench press, the deadlift, and the squat exercise, then lifting a heavy weight for those 3 exercises is a great recommendation. But if you're not training a power lifter, then lifting a very heavy weight might really just be about practicing the skill. Now, some of our studies have looked at the idea of heavy load and light load training. But one of the key things that we've done is we've looked at impartial testing methods. So what we tend to use is isometric testing, but we use dynamic training. And we've had people train with loads as light as 30% of 1 repetition max and as heavy as 80% of 1 repetition max. And we found very, very similar strength increases between the 2 groups when they're tested isometrically, so when they're tested impartially. And by testing impartially, you remove that skill element of lifting a heavy weight. If you were to have 2 groups both training on a squat exercise, and one lifted a very heavy weight for 10 weeks and one lifted a very light weight for 10 weeks, then arguably the group lifting the heavy weight might get stronger simply because of practicing that motor schema, practicing that lifting of a heavy weight. And then finally, one of the things that's not really been talked about, and myself and a colleague, Dr. James Steele, have been looking at more and more recently, is something called discomfort. Now, this is not effort. Effort is the maximal sort of physiological effort that we apply to lifting a resistance. So if you consider lifting 1 repetition max, then your effort would be maximal, but your discomfort would be low. Whereas if you continue to perform maximal repetitions, then your effort would remain high, but your discomfort would gradually increase with the number of repetitions. And this is exactly what we found. So we had the same groups of people performing heavy load and light load resistance training. And the group that were lifting a heavy load reported quite moderate degrees of discomfort. The group that were lifting a very light load reported far higher degrees of discomfort. And discomfort really we can consider as pain. So the question that I always ask is, would you rather do a set of back squats or leg presses with 80% or 60% of your one repetition max to failure, or with 20 or 30% of your one repetition max to failure? And certainly the lighter load will require a far higher number of repetitions, and as such will induce a far higher degree of discomfort. Now, the reason this is a factor is in any studies where they have compared heavy load and light load training, and especially where they've used very light loads, if people have performed a very, very high number of repetitions, then they might have stopped exercise as a result of the discomfort rather than as a result of the effort, rather than as a result of reaching momentary muscular failure. So if they stop because of discomfort, then they're not going to get the same motor unit and muscle fiber recruitment, and they're unlikely to make the same strength and hypertrophy adaptations. So this is the factor that really needs to be taken into account. And then finally, and we can see this more and more from Stu Phillips's lab and Brad Schoenfeld's lab, that hypertrophic adaptations actually seem very, very similar regardless of the load used. Loads as light as 30% of one repetition max compared to 80% of one repetition max produce very similar increases, both at a fiber level as well as at a whole muscle level. So the evidence is really swinging away from the idea of a strength endurance continuum for muscle hypertrophy. The next problem that I would identify with the idea of a strength and endurance continuum is the data itself. And so I've cited 3 studies across the bottom there, 2 by Hoga and 1 by Shimano. And what these studies have found is that there's a large variation in the number of repetitions that can be performed at a given percentage of one repetition max. There's variation based on the muscle group, there's variation based on the sex, so males or females, and there's variation based on the training status, so untrained and trained. And this is really important because if you give somebody or prescribe somebody a training load of 80% of one repetition max, believing that they're performing they're training for maximal strength, or that you prescribe 60% of one repetition max because you are planning for them to train for muscular endurance, this might not be as clear as we think. So here's some of their data. So we can see at the top is untrained males and the bottom is trained males. And the exercises listed on the left are leg press, lat pull down, bench press, knee extension, sit-ups, arm curl, and leg curl. And if we slide across 3 columns, we can see 80% of one repetition max. Well, for the leg press, at 80% of one repetition max, untrained males are performing around 15 repetitions. But if we slide to the bottom, we can see that the leg curl produces, or for the leg curl, sorry, untrained males are only able to perform around 6 repetitions at 80% of one rep max. So with that in mind, if we're truly prescribing maximal strength, 80% can induce failure at around 6 repetitions on the leg curl, but we need to use a far heavier load for a leg press. We can also see variance in the bottom of the slide there in the trained males. And if we skip to the next slide, we'll see the same here for untrained females and for trained females. So we can see that this time for untrained females, at 80%, the leg press is around 12 reps. But for trained females, the leg press is now around 22 or 23 repetitions. So we need to take into account, if the strength and endurance continuum is to be taken at face value, then surely the percentage of one repetition max doesn't always equate to a given number of repetitions. So we can't be as clear cut as to say this load equals this number of reps. It varies between group, between training status, between exercise, and between males and females. And that's certainly a factor that never seems to have been considered. And then finally, we need some clarity. So the reason I've said that we need clarity is because there's actually two types of muscular endurance. There's absolute muscular endurance and there's relative muscular endurance. So absolute muscular endurance is the ability to perform repetitions with an exact load. So if I give an example that my bench press is 100 kilos and I perform as many my bench press one repetition max is 100 kilos, and I lift a load of 50 kilos for as many repetitions as I can, then that's a test of absolute muscular endurance. If I get stronger and my bench press increases to 200 kilos, then my absolute muscular endurance test stays at 50 kilos. And you can imagine now, if I can bench press 200 kilos, then I can perform a large number of repetitions with the original 50 kilos. And that's absolute muscular endurance. Now, if we put that into context for relative muscular endurance, we'll see the difference. So relative muscular endurance is a percentage of our one repetition max. So again, using the same example, if I can bench press 100 kilos for a one repetition max, then 50% of it is 50 kilos, and I might perform a certain number of repetitions. As I get stronger through my training intervention to be able to bench press 200 kilos, 50% of that is now 100 kilos. So in fact, the load has increased relative to my maximal strength. And in doing so, the actual number of repetitions I can perform has hardly changed, and we'll see that in some of the following tables. So here's some data. So the first couple of slides are absolute muscular endurance. And you can see the exercises listed down the side there. They're all from different studies. So a number of studies obviously have looked at bench press, and there's a study there with back squat, and there's a study there with leg extension. And we can see the strength testing, that they're pre and they're post one repetition max. And we can see that in all the studies, the strength increased. Now, on the right-hand side of the table, you can see absolute muscular endurance testing. And it lists the load. So it was a percentage of the pre-intervention one repetition max, but it was the absolute load they were interested in. So they tested them for how many repetitions they could perform with that load at the start of the intervention, and then again at the end of the intervention. And what we can see is the pre number of repetitions is 25, and the post number of repetitions is 32. So in accordance with the strength increase, so the number of repetitions being performed for absolute muscular endurance has also increased. And if I put in the blue arrows that I've added, we can see, and we can generally say, that as strength increases, so too, relatively proportionately, does the number of repetitions that can be performed with an absolute load. If we move on to relative muscular endurance, we see something slightly different. So again, these are some similar studies. We can see similar exercises, bench press, back squat, and so forth. And this time we can also see that the strength increases, so 62 to 76 kilos, 74 to 102 kilos, and so forth. But this time they were tested with a percentage of their one repetition max. So the pre-test was done with 80% of their pre-intervention one repetition max. And the post-test was done with 80% of the post-intervention one repetition max. And if we look at the number of repetitions there, we can see the number of repetitions actually hardly changes from pre to post. And if I add in the blue lines, then we can say our strength increases, but our relative muscular endurance stays the same. And that's pretty consistent across the board for all of those studies and all of those exercises at the various loads. So 40%, 60%, and 80% of one repetition max. So we also can't say that muscular endurance increases with a light load, because we need to clarify whether we're talking about absolute or relative muscular endurance. So I've summarized that slide already. So all I've said there is absolute muscular endurance, the repetitions at the same load increases. With relative muscular endurance, as strength increases, the repetitions at an increased load shows almost no change. Okay, now it's always worthwhile looking at some of the contrasting evidence, and I've highlighted a study here by Campos et al. From 2002. And the reason I'm going to talk about this one is this is probably the most commonly cited intervention that looks at the strength and endurance continuum. So they had 3 groups: a low rep group, which were using a heavy weight, 3 to 5 repetition max, an intermediate rep group using a moderate weight of 9 to 11 rep max, and a high rep group with a lighter weight performing 20 to 28 rep max. They found some differences between the groups, but not consistent. But the interesting ones that we're going to look at is the low rep group, so the very heavy weight, increased the 1 repetition max leg press and squat exercises compared to the other groups. Now, I've already said that if we're practicing something that's got such a skill element as a back squat, then we probably would expect people practicing with a heavy weight to improve their maximal strength. For the leg press, we might not. So let's just have a look at some of the data. The authors didn't report the raw data. We're looking at the table, the graph, sorry, on the right-hand side with the red circle around it. We used a digitization program to estimate some of the values. And we can see there that pre-intervention, the low rep group, intermediate rep, and high rep group also had a pretty similar maximal strength. And the post-intervention, there was quite significant changes. So the low rep group, the heavyweight group, improved to 498 kilos, the intermediate rep to 398, and the high rep group to 364. And the relative increases are there, the percentage increases are also shown. If we look at the number of repetitions they could perform, then again, this is shown. So this was at 60% of 1 repetition max. So, and this was the relative muscular endurance. This is worth noting. So the low rep, the heavyweight group, could perform 40 repetitions with 60% of their 1RM. But at the end of the intervention, they could only perform 32 repetitions. The high rep, the light training group, could perform 35 repetitions with 60% of their 1RM. But at the end of the intervention, could perform 68 reps. That's a 94% increase. Now, it's worth looking at this because they had a 32% increase in strength from 300 to 364 kilos in the high rep group, in the lightweight group. And they had a 94% increase in the number of repetitions. So if we look at the percentages, 60% of the pre-intervention 1 repetition max was 180 kilos, where they performed 35 reps. And now at the end of the intervention, they can lift 364 kilos as their 1 rep max, but their 60% for their muscular endurance is now 218 kilos, and they can now perform 68 repetitions. So that's quite a considerable change, and it's interesting that the raw data wasn't presented, and it would be great to speak to the authors about some of these anomalies. Now, the other reason that this study is worth talking about is because it's actually the only study that tested the true repetition ranges highlighted by the ACSM and the NSCA, 3 to 5 rep max, 9 to 11 rep max, and then a high rep group, and they used 20 to 28, but you know, it wasn't too high. And they actually found similar hypertrophy adaptations in the low rep, in the heavyweight group, and in the intermediate rep, so in the moderate weight group. And that was for both type 1, type 2A, and type 2B fibers. And we can see the values there are pretty similar between the 2 groups. So it's an interesting study to look at, certainly the only one really that lends itself to supporting the strength and endurance continuum. Okay, so really, why is there contrasting evidence? Well, some of the other studies have used very high repetition ranges of 30 to 40 RM or 100 to 150 RM. And we already know that there's probably a higher degree of discomfort, but there's also, that training with a degree of discomfort can lead to increased pain tolerance. So as you get used to performing, or as you train with 150 repetitions, you might adapt to training with 150 repetitions. So your endurance might increase more with a very light load as a product of your familiarization to the discomfort. They also, for some of the studies, used a predetermined tempo. So if you were practicing 30 to 40 repetitions per minute, and then you were tested at 30 to 40 repetitions per minute, again, there's a skill element to consider. And finally, there might be a bit of a margin of error in the testing of maximal load and or repetitions, 1 or 2 kilos or 1 or 2 repetitions, which might or might not cause a difference. What does all this mean? Well, firstly, I would say that this supports that participants can self-select a load, and that different loads, if taken to momentary failure, produce similar increases in strength and hypertrophy, and that an increase in strength shows an increase in absolute muscular endurance, but that any increase in strength doesn't show much of a change to relative muscular endurance at all. And my final statement there is that the evidence supporting the strength and endurance continuum is very limited, and that actually this is not what Thomas DeLorme was ever trying to set out. So that's the title of the paper there, The Strength Endurance Continuum Revisited. It's published in the Journal of Trainology, so feel free to go and look it up. Thank you very much to my co-authors there listed on the paper, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. James Fisher. I think that was really important to clarify. I mean, we all I mean, in the fitness industry, we have this idea to put everything into little boxes, and with the biological variety between different individuals, the physiological manifestations of strength training might not occur exactly as some of the numbers show, as you so clearly pointed out.
Thank you.
We're gonna move on to our questions from our audience, and we have our first question coming up. This question is from Shiraz, and he asks, can you explain the effect of heavy weight and light weight on joints? And is it true that low weight help in joint tissue regeneration from previous injury? Over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it's unfortunately something I don't have a definite answer to. But really what we're asking is, are there any other factors that we should consider? And certainly if people take away from this presentation, oh, I can train with a very light weight, I would say, well, you might be leaving something behind, because you might not be improving your bone mineral density in the same way that you might do with heavier loads. Now, when it comes to joints, I think there's no clear research that I know of that supports the idea of specifically using heavy weights or specifically using light weights. I think we can use a common sense approach that very, very heavy weights might have more risk on the joint, especially if the exercise isn't being performed safely. But I also think that we should consider that light weights are a safer alternative if the exercise is performed maybe at a very high velocity or is performed with dangerous technique. So I think that there are other factors to consider there. In a similar question, somebody once asked me, do I think there's a value for pre-exhaustion? And a guy, Roger Schwab, who I spoke with a few years back, who some people listening might know the name, he suggested to me that one of the great benefits of pre-exhaustion is performing an isolated movement before a compound movement means that we reduce the weight that we would use for the compound movement, and therefore we put less strain on our joints. And I think that as we increase our strength, and certainly is true for maybe bodybuilders or powerlifters where they're lifting very heavy weights, there might be something in the idea of reducing the weight down to save the wear and tear on the joints. Certainly, if we look at some of the pro bodybuilders of the past, people like Ronnie Coleman and his knees, then we can consider that there is certainly potential health implications of lifting very heavy weights for a prolonged period of time upon the stress on our joints. So I hope that answers the question, Shiraz.
I think that was very clear. I think it all obviously depends on the individual, and as you pointed out, Ronnie Coleman is an example. I mean, he's had his training always at the same way, and that had a toll on his joints, on his health. So probably if he had, and obviously what I'm saying is speculation, but if he had in a certain way planned his trainings so that he, in some days he would train with lighter weights, probably it wouldn't have that effect, because he was always training heavy.
I think that's possible, yeah.
Absolutely. We got another one coming up. This is from Alvaro Monteiro, and he asks if we rely on the percentage of RM and reps to help athletes achieve their goals, such as strength, hypertrophy, or endurance. What other parameters should we rely on to attain their objectives? I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think there's more and more research supporting that if exercise is taken to the point of momentary failure or close to momentary failure, then adaptations in strength, in hypertrophy, and in absolute muscular endurance are very similar. So with that in mind, I just think that we're now freed from this prescription of having to use a heavy weight if we want to increase strength, or a lightweight for endurance, or so forth. It means that if you're working with cyclists, you don't have to be fearful of bulking up, but you also don't have to use a very heavy weight with somebody who wants to get stronger. So people at home right now who don't have the same access to weights that they did previously can still do an exercise set and still improve their strength. Now, the muscle mass issue, the hypertrophy issue, I think is probably more a factor of volume of training. There's more and more evidence that's swaying me that if we perform a higher volume, whether that's the number of sets per exercise or the number of exercises per muscle group, to increase muscle mass. Now, some people don't want to add muscle. Some people do want to add muscle. So I think that that's something that can be managed by the trainer themselves or by the coach and so forth. But I would say that this we should think of this as setting us free from having to use a predetermined load or predetermined repetitions. We can now choose the cadence, the repetition duration that we want to use, and we can now perform whatever number of repetitions we feel is appropriate for that client. Now, we might find that some clients can't reach true muscular failure if they're performing more than 6 or 7 reps. But we also might find that other clients might need to use a lighter weight because they don't want that initial strain of lifting a very heavy weight. So I think this is where, as practitioners, the people listening can really choose for themselves based on their client. And this is what personal training is all about.
Thank you so much, Dr. James Fisher. Got another question coming up. Just a second. There we are. This is a question from Renato Nobre. Wouldn't it be reasonable to use more times the low, or I suppose it's high rep to protect joints? The low or IM rep to protect joints. I suppose it's low load, high reps, I suppose.
Again, I think this is similar to the previous question, so we'll take it in the same way. I think that we don't know. I think that it makes sense that using a lighter load might be more cautious for our joints, and certainly joint health is something that's got to be a factor. I'm 42 years old, and I want to be doing the same workouts that I do now when I'm 82 years old. Now, I'm not going to retain the same amount of muscle mass, although I'm going to try, and I might not retain the same strength, but I certainly want my joints to be able to cope in the same way. So I think that's really important. I think more of that comes down to exercise technique and maybe even speed of movement, repetition duration, than perhaps the weight being lifted. I personally don't lift very heavy weights. I very infrequently perform single maximal effort lifts, but I do take most of my sets to most of my exercises to muscular failure. So with that in mind, I think that as long as we're controlled over the exercise that we use, then I think the heavy load or the lighter load is probably equally as safe.
I think it always depends on the person and the objective, and obviously the process of progression. Because if you always train in a certain way, that's probably going to be detrimental. But if you plan the proper progression gradually, parameter by parameter, it's probably going to be safer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. James Fisher. It was a pleasure to learn from you once more. And I would like to conclude this webinar by inviting all of you guys to follow us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. On behalf of EXS Exercise School, I would like to thank you all, to those who have attended this webinar around the world and for being with us today. To all our speakers, we would like to express our gratitude. Thank you for your time, dedication, and the knowledge you have provided to this amazing audience. This webinar could not have been organized if it wasn't for the support of our partners and sponsors. I would like to express to them our profound gratitude. Given the success of this event, which exceeded our expectations, I can already disclose that we'll be organizing a second one later this year. So guys, keep an eye on our social media for the announcement. Very soon, we will announce our online platform with educational content in English and Portuguese. Therefore, keep an eye on our social media. Thank you all so very much. I hope to see you again soon in the near future. As our colleague and CEO of EXS, Hugo Muniz, likes to say, we are all stronger together. Stay safe. Yeah.